I am Daisy Ex Machina, the drag queen detective who investigates all things speculative in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. I have put together a list of my favorite top 100 science fiction authors, broke it up into 10 segments, put it in alphabetical order, and I'm now putting the segments back together in one video. The list includes authors from the golden age of science fiction up to contemporary authors, and authors who write adult, and authors who write children's or YA. I've already released the 10 segments, so this is me just kind of wanting to see them all put together in one place, so go ahead and skip this video if you've seen them already. But for everyone else, let's jump in. First in the list is Douglas Adams. Adams is an English author born in 1952 and unfortunately died at the very young age of 49. And did you know he was in Monty Python's Flying Circus? Yes, he was discovered by Graham Chapman and had a couple of brief appearances in the fourth season and some writing credits. He discovered he was more of a writer than performer, and he went on to write for Doctor Who. But of course, he is most known for The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, published in 1980. This is a science fiction must-read, especially if you like the absurd, the satirical, and that really dry British humor. Personally, I think it is hilarious, but humor is subjective, so your mileage may vary. There are actually 6 books in the Hitchhiker series, but the last book, which I haven't read and I just heard about this, was written by Ian Colfer, who was a writer of the children's series Artemis Fowl, and apparently had permission from Adams' estate to write this 6th book. Anyway, my recommendation is really just for the first 3 books: Hitchhiker's Guide, Restaurant at the End of the Universe, and Life, the Universe, and Everything. He also wrote the Dirk Gently books, which are pretty good too, but start with The Hitchhiker's Guide to see if the humor is for you. Changing course, I have picked Thea Alexander, who is basically known for only one book, 2150 AD, published in 1971. Now, I read this as part of a study group back in the 90s, and I'll tell you right away, this is not a book for everyone. Some people will read it and find it way too woo-woo or new age or whatever. If you don't like that sort of thing, skip this book. But if you want to explore a utopian future or alternate spirituality, maybe pick this one up. It's about a man named John from 1976 who astrally travels to, you guessed it, 2150 AD. Anyway, I liked it a lot when I read it, and I know it's on many people's favorite book list. I like it on this list because it's just one of those one-hit wonders. I don't think the author ever wrote or published another work of fiction. It's a one-off, but it's had an interesting impact and history. The next author on the list is Charlie Jane Anders, who's also a trans activist, born in 1969 and has garnered many awards, including the Hugo, Nebula, and Lambda Literary. The Anders novel I read that blew me away and that I recommend is All the Birds in the Sky, published in 2016. Now, this could easily go into fantasy because it's kind of about fantasy versus science, the world of witches versus the world of mad scientists. Dare we say it's a metaphor between the emotional versus the intellectual. It has an almost experimental literary bent to it. It's about Patricia, a girl who grows into a woman with the powers of a witch, and her friend Lawrence, the techno-geek boy who grows up into, well, let's just say a mad scientist. Are they enemies? Are they lovers? What is it? It's complicated, and a book you've got to check out. Now, of course, I had no plan to have 2 trans authors in a row, but alphabetical means alphabetical. And next up is Ryka Aoki, who wrote the amazing novel Light from Uncommon Stars in 2021. It was nominated for a Hugo and won the Otherwise Award, which was previously known as the James Tiptree Jr. Award. This one Also maybe could go into fantasy, but it has spaceships, so let's put it in science fiction. The plot is crazy. It's about a young woman named Katrina Wynn, who is a violinist of exceptional skill who is also trans and suffers from an exceptional lack of self-worth. She becomes a student of the world's best violin teacher, Shizuka Satomi, who also happens to sell the souls of violinists to the devil in exchange for fame. Yes, I know, fantasy, but Shizuka falls in love with the local donut shop owner who happens to be an alien starship captain. Yes, the book is as nuts as it sounds, but it's brilliant. Ultimately, it's about Katrina's journey to self-discovery and self-empowerment. We're going to take another sharp turn and go really old school with Isaac Asimov. If you are into science fiction, you know who Asimov is. He was considered one of the big three science fiction writers of his day, along with Robert Heinlein and Arthur C. Clarke. He was born in 1920 in Russia and immigrated with his parents to New York in 1923. He was also one of the most prolific authors ever, publishing more than 500 books in a bunch of different genres, but of course, he is known for science fiction. The I, Robot book, which is a fix-up novel of short stories that first appeared in pulp magazines, was published in 1950 and is maybe the most influential book when it comes to robots or AI with the 3 laws of robotics. And then there is the Foundation books. The first one was published in 1951, which was also a fix-up novel, which introduced the concept of psychohistory, which challenged the concept that hard science fiction could maybe include the soft sciences. But my personal favorite Asimov novel is The Gods Themselves, published in 1972, which won the Hugo and Nebula. It's about first contact with aliens in a parallel universe and alternates between the human and alien point of view. And the story encompasses the wonderful quote, "Against stupidity, the gods themselves contend in vain." The next author you may not know of, but I think is brilliant, A. Attanasio, who wrote Radix, published in 1981. It's the first book in a series known as the Radix Tetrad, and that's 4 books. Radix was nominated for Nebula, but won the French literary award that I've never heard of called the Prix Cosmos. Anyway, he was big in France, which seems to happen when Americans don't understand something, and Radix is a hard one to wrap your mind around. It's set in the far, far, far future about a man who goes on maybe a hero's journey or epic odyssey and eventually becomes a demigod, kind of, maybe. Anyway, if you like mind benders, check out Radix. Now, let's jump to an author I think all of you know, Margaret Atwood, the Canadian writer born in 1939, who wrote The Handmaid's Tale, published in 1985. Now, I remember when this came out because I was an assistant manager at a bookstore, and it was always shelved in general fiction rather than science fiction. But obviously, it's science fiction, but it's one of those science fiction books that the gods of publishing deemed has written above that low-class science fiction genre. The same thing happened to Vonnegut's later works. Anyway, The Handmaid's Tale, which has recently been given a second life thanks to the amazing Hulu adaptation, is a cautionary tale about what could happen, specifically to women, if the United States is taken over by a hard-right, fundamental, ultra-religious party during a crisis when few babies can be born. Spoiler alert, it doesn't go so great for women. Anyway, it's a dystopian novel that hits many people, including me, maybe a little too close to home. Moving alphabetically from A's to B's, we find Paolo Bacigalupi, a science fiction writer I've only recently discovered a few years ago, though the book I read was published in 2009. I am talking about The Wind-Up Girl, his debut novel. It blew me away. Now, this has been termed biopunk, which I kind of like. It's set in Thailand in the 23rd century when global warming has made food production the number one commodity that mega corporations battle over, with ever-evolving forms of genetic modification to create calories. The main character isn't very likable, so it's a bit of an anti-hero story. He's Anderson Lake, the corporate spy from America trying to steal Thailand's seed bank. The eponymous wind-up girl is a minor side character named Amiko at first, but she doesn't really come into her own until later in the novel. She's an artificial human, but still human, who is discarded from her owner and used as a sex worker or slave. This is a gritty, dark story, but somehow it isn't as depressing as I'm making it out. Certainly, this is an author to keep an eye on. One of my favorite science fiction authors is Iain Banks, and that's for the culture novels. Banks is a Scottish author who came to fame with a horror novel called The Wasp Factory. Now, I've read The Wasp Factory, and it's one of the creepiest stories I've ever read, and I usually don't like slasher horror, but that's what this one is, and let's just say it's different. But it has a ton of trigger warnings, so enter at your own risk. But for science fiction, I absolutely love the Culture series, which starts with Consider Phlebas, which was published in 1987. The Culture is a far future society described as a post-scarcity anarchist utopia. Now, how do humans find utopia? They basically give up control to artificial intelligence machines known as the minds. In Consider Phlebas, the Culture is at war with the Ideran Empire, and one of the minds is hiding out as a refugee on a world controlled by godlike beings who are incorporeal. The Ideran Empire is, of course, intent on capturing the mind and sends in an operative who is also a shapeshifter known as Horza. This is such a great first novel in the Culture books, and I should mention that we're calling it a series, but they really are standalone novels just set in the same universe. Unfortunately, Banks died in 2013 at the age of 59, but he has left behind a substantial number of works, including 10 Culture novels. Finally, for this video anyway, we're going to end with an oldie but a goodie, Alfred Bester, one of our authors from the golden age of science fiction. Harry Harrison, who we'll cover in a later video, but he said Alfred Bester was one of the handful of writers who invented modern science fiction. And who are we to disagree? Bester was born in 1913 and died in 1987. The work he is most known for, and one I recommend all science fiction fans should read, is The Demolished Man, published in 1953, though it was serialized before that in Galaxy Science Fiction. The Demolished Man is set in the future where telepathy is common, though telepaths have varying degrees of powers and the most powerful can dominate the weaker. Kind of reminds me of Scanners. The story starts with a rather elaborate murder involving a slightly insane corporate CEO, and then it turns into a police procedural led by a telepathic police detective. Oh, if you recognize the name Alfred Bester from Babylon 5, yes, they named one of the Psychor characters after the author. And another book I'll mention is one I remember being absolutely blown away with. It's one of the last books that Bester wrote, and I got it when it was first published in 1980, Gullum 100. Has anyone read that besides me? You can't seem to find it anywhere, and it has gotten savage on Goodreads, so maybe my tastes were just weird when I was a teenager. I do remember it felt very experimental, especially towards the ending when they had text interspersed with cartoon drawings. Anyway, Alfred Bester, science fiction legend. And the first author is why I'm dressed up in my Star Trek uniform, because it is James Blish. Blish was born in 1921 and began his career in the golden age of science fiction starting in 1940 and was a member of the Futurians, a New York group of progressive science fiction authors that included Isaac Asimov, Damon Knight, Judith Merril, and many others. He won the Hugo in 1959 for his novel A Case of Conscience. I personally recommend Cities in Flight, which is kind of a fix-up novel about space-traveling cities. It started as a 4-volume set, but I think you can get it as 1 volume now. But his claim to fame came from Star Trek, which made Blish a household name, and which he later said accounted for his financial stability. He was commissioned to write the adaptations of Star Trek, the original series. He would base them on early drafts of the scripts, so they were often different and diverged from what was on TV. There was a total of 12 volumes of Star Trek adaptations. He also wrote 1 novel, Spock Must Die. He planned to write more, including one devoted to Harry Mudd, but sadly he passed away in 1975 at the young age of 54. The author I have following James Blish is one you all know would be on this list, Ray Bradbury. Born in 1920, Bradbury had a long, prestigious, and prolific career. And in fact, I did a whole video on Bradbury. If you're interested, I'll link it up here. Bradbury is interesting because he wasn't known for hard science fiction at a time when hard science fiction was considered the epitome of science fiction. Rather, his science fiction was soft, more focused on character development, even bordering on fantasy. In fact, one of my favorite books by Bradbury is Something Wicked This Way Comes, which is pure fantasy. But when it comes to science fiction, he is most known for 2 books, Fahrenheit 451, published in 1953 and serialized in Playboy magazine, about a dystopian future where firemen burn books. However, my favorite of his science fiction, and what I think is his most literary and moving, is The Martian Chronicles, published in 1950, which is a fix-up novel. Fix-up is taking previously published short stories and stitching them together into one novel, so it has a very episodic feel to it. And it's about the human colonization of Mars and the tragic confrontation with native Martians. If you haven't read this one, check it out. The next author is one of the best creators of alien races that I've ever read, and that author is David Brinn. Brinn was born in 1950 and came to fame right out of the gate with Sundiver, published in 1980. Its sequel, Startide Rising, published in 1983, won both the Hugo and Nebula. And my favorite in the series, The Uplift Wars, was published in 1987, and that also won the Hugo and was nominated for a Nebula. He wrote more in the series, but the original Uplift novels, the original 3 books or trilogy, is what I think is amazing and which you should really read because they feature some amazing alien races. Alien races are something I really enjoy reading in science fiction. The term uplifting is what is called when you uplift a species from animal to sentience, which all sentient races in the galaxy aspire to do. One of the reasons is when you uplift another race, that race owes their patron race and serves them for some period of time. Humans are kind of small potatoes in this galaxy that Brinn created. Humans are considered weak or not very developed, but they did uplift chimpanzees and dolphins, so they are grudgingly given some respect by the higher alien races. The world building here is some of the best I've ever seen. If you love reading about alien races and how different they can be, if you like your science fiction hard, run, don't walk to Brinn's original Uplift trilogy. The next author came to fame fairly recently, at least for me. His debut novel came crashing out of the gates as a huge phenomena. Of course, I'm talking about Pierce Brown and his Red Rising series. The first book, Red Rising, was published in 2014. Now, some people erroneously, in my opinion, call Red Rising young adult simply because Darrow, the main character, starts off as a teenager in the first book, and in the first book we also see him in a school with other teenagers. But trust me, especially when you get to later books in the series, with all the sex and ultra-violence, these are adult books. The world Brown has created is set in the far, far future when Earth has developed this society that is genetically stratified based on their role to the society, which are named after color. So if you're born a gray, for example, that means you end up in the police or in security. The bottom of the hierarchy are the reds, who basically are grunt labor because they're able to survive in hostile environments. And at the very top are the golds, the leaders. Red Rising is a story of how Darrow, who is born a red, goes through extensive surgical modification to rise up to be a gold in order to tear the society down. The writing has always amazed me. The society is heavily influenced by ancient Greece, and the writing is so ornate that it feels like it could have been taken from some historical Greek text. It's really an amazing work. There's been rumors of a TV or movie adaptation, which I think would be incredible. Check out Red Rising. I cannot wait to talk about the next author because I was obsessed with him through middle school. That is Edgar Rice Burroughs. Burroughs was born in 1875, and his heyday was in the 20s when a lot of his work was published in primarily the pulp magazines. This was before the golden age of science fiction, but his work has inspired many of the golden age writers: Ray Bradbury, Robert Heinlein, Isaac Asimov. Many, many others have cited Burroughs as their inspiration. Now, I was reading Burroughs in the 70s, and I had no clue how old these books were. I think I had a vague idea that they're not recently published, but it never really sunk in that it was published in the 20s. Many of the covers I saw that drew me to it was by Frank Frazetta. I read his Venus series and his Moon Maiden series, but I really liked the Pellucidar or At the Earth's Core series. I did not like Tarzan, which is probably what Burroughs is best known for, except I did read Tarzan at the Earth's Core. Anyway, it was sometime in the late 70s when some publisher released these gorgeous jewel-toned editions of John Carter of Mars, and I fell in love. I was obsessed with John Carter. Now, the character John Carter was a Civil War veteran who goes on to travel to Mars and has many adventures, and I always assumed it was historical fiction as we use the term today. But remember, Burroughs was born in 1875. His parents lived through the Civil War. This was not historical for Burroughs. His work is now in the public domain, so you can read it for free on Project Gutenberg or find copies in used bookstores. Now, these are very soft science fiction, sometimes called Sword and Planet or just space adventure or sometimes space opera. If you're looking for eminently readable stories that inspired the science fiction genre, you might want to check out Edgar Rice Burroughs and John Carter of Mars. Francis Marion Busby, or F.M. Busby, was born in 1921, but he was not part of the golden age of science fiction. He got a late start in his career because he didn't start publishing until he was in his 50s. His first novel, Cage a Man, was published in 1973, and that's the novel I recommend. It's the first in a series of novels about the Daimyo. The Daimyo are an alien race of religious zealots who believe they are the image of God and go through the galaxy not just converting other races, but surgically modifying them to look like the Daimyo, who look a bit like lobsters. Cage a Man is about a man, a human, Taken by the Daemu, and it is a pretty dark, brutal book with lots of body horror. But boy, did this one stick with me in my mind. Maybe it'll stick with you too. Now we come to Octavia Butler, another science fiction author I've done a whole video on. She was born in 1947 and has won many awards, including the Hugo and Nebula, and she also won the very prestigious MacArthur Fellowship, also known as the Genius Grant. One of the very few African-American women who are writing science fiction during the 70s and 80s. Her book, Kindred, was published in 1979 and is about a Black woman who time travels to the antebellum South and meets her ancestors. This was the work, I think, that really elevated her name to be recognized outside of just the science fiction community. My favorite novel of hers has always been Wild Seed, published in 1980, about two immortal Africans who are entwined in a very complicated but mostly contentious relationship through the centuries. This is part of the Patternist series, not the first book in the series, but the first book chronologically. And if you only read one Octavia Butler book, that's the one I recommend. But I bet if you read one, you'll want to read more. Why don't more people talk about Jack Chalker? He was one of my favorite authors in the 70s and 80s and was very prolific. He was born in 1944, and his first novel, Midnight at the Well of Souls, was published in 1977. I think I started reading him after his second novel in the series was published, Exile at the Well of Souls, because of the cover. Look at the cover. His most famous novels are probably in the Well of Souls series, which features the Well World, a huge planet-sized scientific laboratory created by a super race that is now extinct. It's made up of hexagonal grids, where each hexagon is a different environment containing a different race. When a group of humans enter the Well World, each of them are transformed into one of these different species. There's a theme of body transformation in a lot of Chalker's works, which is kind of interesting. I also really loved his Four Lords of the Diamond series. I'm not really sure why he's not as well known as some of the other science fiction authors who were his contemporaries, because I think he has a lot of great books out there. If you've been watching this channel, you know that I love Becky Chambers' Monk and Robot books. Chambers was born in 1985, and her first novel, The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, was met with wide acclaim, but I haven't had a chance to read it yet. If you've read it, let me know if I should down in the comments, and while you're there, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Now, what I have read is A Psalm for the Wild Built, published in 2021, which won the Hugo, and A Prayer for the Crowned Shy, published in 2022, which won the Nebula. Both of these are novellas, so short novels, and they are both utopian solar punk novels. Solar punk is, of course, the subgenre of science fiction that imagines a world where technology and nature can live in harmony. And you'd think a utopian society would be boring for a story if there's no conflict, but there is an inner conflict within the non-binary monk Dex, who travels around the small moon of Panga, serving tea to other humans. Dex is searching for meaning in this utopian existence when they meet Moscap, the first sentient AI robot that has been seen in centuries on Panga. These are philosophical stories delving into what it means to be a person and what true relationships really are. It's also kind of an asexual, aromantic love story, one of my favorites of the 21st century. Finally, we'll wrap up this group of science fiction authors with C.J. Cherryh. Born Carolyn Janice Cherry in 1942, she has been a prolific writer since 1976, and I think she is still publishing today. Many of her works are set in a universe she created called the Alliance Union universe, which spans 27 novels and a bunch of short stories. The Alliance is a confederation of merchants, and the Union is a government that has broken away from Earth. The other very long series she wrote is the Foreigner series, which I believe is now over 20 books. They're broken up into trilogies, and I recommend the first Foreigner trilogy, with Foreigner published in 1994. But my favorite books are the Alliance Union books, and my favorite of those are Citeen, published in 1988. Originally as a trilogy, which is how I read it, but now I think it's all under one volume, and it also won the Hugo. Now, I stopped recommending it to people because people I recommended it to that read it told me that it was kind of boring, which surprised me because I loved it, but I get it. It's more of a psychological and political novel than anything else. It's about a famous politician and scientist in the Union, a genius named Ariane Emery, who is murdered. She is then cloned, and the goal is to recreate this clone exactly in her image by raising her as closely as scientists can to the original Ariane, including all the traumas the original Ariane went through. It's a fascinating story, and if you think it might be for you, go ahead and check it out. Today we start with Michael Chrichton, who was born in 1942 and died in 2008 at the age of 66. Growing up, he was very self-conscious of his height. He was 6'9". That's 206 centimeters for you Europeans. But he was always interested in writing. His experience, however, in the literature department at Harvard was not good. And he changed his major to biological anthropology, which maybe he was able to use for a few of his books. He graduated summa cum laude in 1964, and in the mid-60s he wrote pulp crime novels under the pseudonym John Lang. His first science fiction novel, and the first one published under his name, was in 1969 with The Andromeda Strain, which I still think is one of his best works. It's about a satellite that crashes to Earth and carries with it an extraterrestrial virus. But you may know him from a little novel he published in 1990 called Jurassic Park. This, of course, became a movie directed by Steven Spielberg, but Chrichton also directed a few movies of his own, including one based on his historical novel, The Great Train Robbery. Oh, and you may think he wrote Coma, but that was written by his friend Robin Cook. But Chrichton wrote the screenplay and directed the movie. And this is not much of a surprise to me because I think his writing style is very cinematic. And by that, I mean reading his works feels like watching a movie, which I think is why many of his novels have been successfully adapted to the big screen. And it's a style I think a few authors have, including Stephen King. But he wasn't that well respected among some serious science fiction authors, like, for example, Philip K. Dick. But Chrichton has had quite a big impact on pop culture, and I'd argue has helped make science fiction more welcome in the mainstream. The next author you know would be on this list. Of course he would be, because I'm talking about Sir Arthur C. Clarke, the English author born in 1917 and died in 2008 at the age of 90. He was known as one of the big three in science fiction during his heyday, along with Robert Heinlein and Isaac Asimov. Clarke grew up reading pulp science fiction magazines and had an early interest in astronomy. He served as a radar specialist in the Royal Air Force during World War II and later got a degree in mathematics and physics from King's College. Clarke is the epitome of a hard science fiction writer where the science is the feature of the stories. His first full novel, which was based on an earlier novella, was The City in the Stars, and He followed that with maybe my favorite of Clarke's works, Childhood's End, about first contact with the mysterious race of beings known as the Overlords. Are the Overlords benign? Are they malicious? Why do they never show themselves to humans? It's great, thought-provoking stuff. And by the way, the novel 2001: A Space Odyssey, which he wrote for the movie, is not that great in my opinion, and it's not a good one for people to start with. Go ahead and start with Childhood's End. Many of his speculations were very prescient, especially concerning telecommunication satellites and the World Wide Web. Personally, I'm still waiting for a space elevator. Let's jump to a much more contemporary author. Known for her young adult novels, I am talking about Suzanne Collins and The Hunger Games. Born in 1962, she started her writing career in television, working for Nickelodeon in the early 90s. Her first books were, naturally, children's books, or middle grade books as publishing calls them, with the fantasy series known as the Underland Chronicles, which starts with the book Gregor the Overlander. She followed that with The Hunger Games in 2008, the first young adult book in the Hunger Games trilogy, which includes Catching Fire and Mockingjay. Of course, you know they became blockbuster movies, but they were also best-selling books, and for good reason. Don't let young adult put you off. This is a really good dystopian story set in the aftermath of some apocalyptic event where humanity is divided into a very hierarchical structure with the elite class living in the capital, and everyone else is divided among the districts who basically serve to produce for the elite in the capital. To appease the masses, there is a bread and circuses event known as the Hunger Games, where young people fight to the death, and the winners get to come home as heroes. Katniss Everdeen is our main character who joins the Hunger Games, so her younger sister doesn't have to go. I thought these were well written and creative, and I even liked the prequel, and I never like prequels, but The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, published in 2020, is an anti-hero story about the man who would become the dictator, who is involved in the prototype of the Hunger Games. The next author wrote books that appealed to every goth gay kid in the 80s, and that's Storm Constantine and the Rathru trilogy. She's a British author born in 1956 and died in 2021 at the age of 64. She was very involved in the goth culture of the 80s, especially embracing the aesthetic of androgyny. Her first novel, which was the first in the Rathru trilogy, was The Enchantments of Flesh and Spirit, published in 1987, followed by The Bewitchments of Love and Hate, and concludes with The Fulfillments of Fate and Desire. She would later write more books in the Rathru universe, but these first three are what I think are must-reads. The books tell the story of a post-apocalyptic era where humanity has just evolved into a new race of androgynous beings, the Rathru, who are born of human parents, but they live much longer lives. And they stop aging as teenagers. The trilogy follows the first of the Rathru as they work to carve out a place in this new society and create new social structures in the ruins of human civilization. The stories, I think, are literary and reflect Storm Constantine's interests in the occult and esoteric spiritualities. James S. A. Corey is not an author. They are two authors, Daniel Abraham and Ty Frank. And they are known for one thing, but it's a big thing, The Expanse. The 9-book series starts with Leviathan Wakes, published in 2011, and concludes with Leviathan Falls, published in 2021. It is an amazing science fiction epic set in the future when humans have conquered the solar system. There's no interstellar travel, but they've developed a fusion drive called the Epstein drive that allows for continuous acceleration, and there are settlers on Mars as well as the asteroid belt. The politics are complicated. Earth and Mars are apparently continuously on the brink of war, and those who live in the asteroid belt, the Belters, continuously struggle to survive. The story starts as a detective story with a gumshoe named Joe Miller, who's hired to find the daughter of a rich family back on Earth. This leads him to uncover an alien substance known as a protomolecule, discovered and studied in secret by a mega corporation that is now in way over their heads. The story starts really small, and with each novel, it grows and grows. The politics, the characters, the story, it is all huge and epic, and the type of science fiction that I really love. And it was made into a really great science fiction series, started by the Sci-Fi Channel and then completed by Amazon Prime. The next author is one you probably only know as an editor, Lester Del Rey. He was born in 1915 and died in 1993, and I am sure you've probably heard of Del Rey Books, which is the publishing imprint of Ballantine, later Random House, that specializes in science fiction books. When the imprint was founded, it was with Lester Del Rey and his wife Judy Lynn Del Rey as the editors. But Lester Del Rey started as a writer, selling stories to the pulp magazines in the 30s and 40s, like Robert Heinlein and Andre Norton. His first novels were juvenile science fiction novels. He later wrote many other novels, but he never really took off as a writer. At least I didn't know his writing until I ran across a copy of a book in a used bookstore called Attack from Atlantis, published in 1953. And because I was really familiar with Del Rey, the imprint, I was kind of curious about Lester Del Rey, the writer, so I immediately picked up the book. I believe it was one of his juvenile books because the main character was 17 years old. He somehow was on the crew of a deep-sea nuclear submarine named the Chrichton. And yes, the Chrichton found the lost civilization of Atlantis. Now, the Atlanteans are very high-tech and have force fields and can control dinosaur-sized creatures. And for some reason, they mistake the dog that's kind of the mascot on the submarine as a god. So the crew of the Triton are imprisoned on Atlantis and must work out how to escape. It's not a bad story. It's fun. It was a glimpse into the mind of the editor who would be the midwife to many great books and the careers of many great authors. An interesting thing about the Del Rey imprint is his wife, Judy Lynn, who was born with dwarfism, may have been the better editor, at least according to Philip K. Dick, who said she was the best editor he ever worked with and called her a master craftsman. Moving on, we come to Samuel R. Delaney, another of my favorites. Delaney was born in 1942 and at one time was pretty much known as the only African-American science fiction writer. He was first published in 1962 with the novel The Jewels of Aptor. He continued publishing novels and honing his craft, gaining recognition in the sci-fi community until Babel 17 came out in 1966, which won the Nebula Award for Best Novel, tied with Flowers for Algernon, and was also nominated for the Hugo. Babel 17 is one I highly recommend, especially as an introduction to Delaney. It's about a Chinese starship captain named Ryka Wong, who is also a telepath who must learn the language of an alien race that is invading human civilization. It's a really interesting exploration into how language shapes thought and perception. Since then, he's written many great science fiction novels like Nova and Triton, but my absolute favorite is his magnum opus called Science Fiction's Version of Ulysses because of its density. I am talking about Dahlgren, published in 1975. This is a really hard novel to get into because there really is no plot. It's a hallucinatory slice of life reflecting the author's queerness and psychedelic perception of timelessness. Again, this is not a novel for everyone, which is why I'm not really recommending it. But like many who have read it, I am a huge fan. Okay, I've already mentioned him twice in this video, so now we come to the man himself, Philip K. Dick, born in 1953 and died very young at the age of 53 in 1982, just 4 months before the release of Blade Runner, the very well-regarded movie based on one of Dick's stories. I have a confession to make. I find Philip K. Dick's writing hard to get into. For me, just for me, I don't find his writing very accessible, so he's not my favorite writer, but I have read many of his works. His first novel was published in 1955 called Solar Lottery. He continued to write through that decade and apparently lost several manuscripts, ergo the lost manuscripts of Philip K. Dick. He became well known in the science fiction circles after The Man in the High Castle won the Hugo in 1963, which posited, what if the Axis powers won World War II and split America between the Nazis and the Japanese Empire? His stories are psychedelic and reflect Dick's very complicated life that includes struggles with mental illness, drugs, and apparently the very real surveillance by the U.S. government. For my recommendation, it would have to be Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, published in 1968, which Blade Runner is based on. But if you want to explore his more difficult and personal writing, I'd recommend Valise. Valise was published in 1981 and is the name of either a satellite or a movie or an alien space probe. You have to read it to understand. I know I'm going to get some flack about my next author because he is mostly known for his fantasy, and that is Stephen R. Donaldson. I know he's known for the epic adult, very adult fantasy, The Thomas Covenant Chronicles, which started with Lord Fal's Bane, published in 1977. I liked those at the time when they were published, but it's a hard one for some people to get into because the main character is basically a rapist. But even more intense than that is what I think is his best work, the 5-volume science fiction epic, The Gap Cycle, which starts with The Gap into Conflict, the real story, published in 1991, and ends with The Gap into Ruin, This Day All Gods Die, published in 1996. This is the epitome of space opera because it is not only set in the far, far future when humanity has spread through the galaxy, but is based on an actual opera, Wagner's Ring Cycle. This is an extremely dark story and has all the trigger warnings you'll find in Lord Fal's Bane, turned up to an 11. And none of the characters are likable, but the story is so fascinating, so raw, so dark, so intense. There are 3 main players: Morn Hyland, who is kind of a policewoman in space, Angus Thermopylae, a brutal space pirate, and a swashbuckling hero who is not really a hero, named Nick Sicurso. Throughout the series, as humanity is threatened by an alien race, it's never clear who are the heroes and who are the villains, or if the roles flip-flop. I wish more people knew about this series, but my suspicion is that fans of Donaldson's fantasy weren't interested in science fiction, and fans of science fiction, at least at the time these books were published, weren't interested in multi-book epics. But if you think you might be interested in really dark, brutal, disturbing space operas, check out The Gap Cycle. The last author in this list is Diane Dwayne, born in 1952. She left her job where she worked as a psychiatric nurse in 1976 to move to California and become an assistant to David Gerrold. If that name sounds familiar, he got his start in the original Star Trek as a scriptwriter and eventually turned into an award-winning novelist. Anyway, Diane Dwayne first published in 1979 an epic fantasy called The Door into Fire, the first in the Middle Kingdom series. It wasn't that successful. What was more successful was her young adult series called The Young Wizards that starts with, so you want to be a wizard. But the reason she is here in this science fiction list, now remember, I said she started as an assistant to David Gerrold, who was associated with Star Trek, and I don't know how much this connection played in her career, but she became known, at least how I knew her, for her Star Trek novels. The first being The Wounded Sky, published in 1983, But my favorite is Spock's World, published in 1988, which I think is one of the best Star Trek novels ever published. It picks up on the storyline of Amok Time in the original series, where Spock is engaged to a conniving Vulcan named T'Pring. In Spock's World, T'Pring is now the leader of a Vulcan faction seeking to separate itself from the Federation because they claim that contact with the emotions of humans is corrupting the Vulcan race. We are back with the three main characters of the original series, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. McCoy gets some great screen time or page time. We get lots of Vulcan politics and lots of Sarek and Amanda. I'm not the only one who fell in love with this Star Trek novel. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for 8 weeks. Let's kick off this video with Harlan Ellison, who I've done a whole video on asking if he should be canceled, which has gotten me into a little bit of trouble because of the clickbaity title. But I concluded that he's not canceled for me, but you should make up your own mind. Anyway, watch the video to find out more. Harlan Ellison was born in 1934 and died in 2018 at the age of 84. He never wrote full-length novels. He was mainly known for short stories, for which he has won many awards. It's definitely worth checking out one of his collections. Keep an eye out for Repent, Harlequin, said the TikTok man, and I have no mouth, and I must scream. His best longish fiction is a novella, A Boy and His Dog, published in 1970, a post-apocalyptic story of a young man and his telepathic dog. Someone posited to me this interesting theory that he didn't write really long novels because his rage that's contained in his writing couldn't be sustained for that long. So it's an interesting supposition. Harlan Ellison wrote the award-winning Star Trek episode, The City on the Edge of Forever, which was a little controversial since he didn't like the adaptation from his script, and I'll compare the two. Check it out. But my strongest recommendation for Ellison is as an editor with his award-winning anthologies, Dangerous Visions, published in 1967, and again Dangerous Visions, published in 1972, where he gathered an amazing array of science fiction authors of the day. If you're a science fiction aficionado, you've got to check these anthologies out. Moving right along, we come to Nancy Farmer, born in 1941, who is known for her novels aimed at young adults. And the book I'm recommending, The House of the Scorpion, published in 2002, is classified as young adult. But I think it could have been published for adults without issue or really anyone questioning it. It's a near-future dystopian novel of a young boy named Matt who lives in the land of opium, which is where Mexico used to be in the story. Opium is a drug farm run by El Patron, a ruthless drug lord who is 140 years old. How is he that old? Well, Matt happens to be a clone of El Patron. Let your imagination take it from there. This novel won a bunch of awards and was a Newbery honor. The writing is really intense and allegedly based on Nancy Farmer's experience of rescuing a Mexican immigrant who was dying in the desert. The sequel, Lord of Opium, was published in 2013 and is also very good, but I encourage you, even if you normally shy away from young adult novels, to give The House of the Scorpion a try. We have yet another farmer, Philip Jose Farmer, born in 1918 and died in 2009 at the age of 91. His career spanned 60 years. He wrote almost 60 novels and over 100 short stories. He didn't shy away from X-rated sexual scenes and was a free love advocate. In fact, Robert Heinlein included Farmer in his dedication for Stranger in a Strange Land. In 1975, he wrote Venus on a Half Shell under the pseudonym of Kilgore Trout, which was the fictional author created by Kurt Vonnegut. Apparently, he never got Vonnegut's permission, and Vonnegut allegedly called Farmer up to cuss him out when he found out who was behind it. I remember getting Venus on a Half Shell when it came out because I couldn't believe there was a Kilgore Trout novel. I don't remember much about the novel itself, but I remember the author picture looked kind of like a mop with a hat. Anyway, I recommend his most famous series, Riverworld, which starts with To Your Scattered Bodies Go, published in 1971, which is, by the way, in the subgenre called Banksian fantasy, or a story set in the afterlife. This first Riverworld novel follows the afterlife of British adventurer Richard Francis Bacon, who dies and wakes up on a river with a bunch of other people who have just died. The afterlife, it turns out, is a big giant river, aka Riverworld, where he meets all sorts of historical figures and tries to figure out what's going on. He finds out that every time he dies in Riverworld, he wakes up somewhere else on the bank of the river, which is useful to get out of certain situations. The novels are wild, and I recommend the whole series. Our next author is Alan Dean Foster, born in 1946, and as far as I know, he's still active. His Pip and Flink series began with The Tar Ain Krang, published in 1972. It's a long-running series about Flinks, who is an orphan, and Pip, which is this mini dragon alien pet companion, going on a series of adventures. And the last Pip and Flink's novel was apparently published in 2017. But Foster is known more for adapting shows and movies into books, notably Star Trek, the animated series, the Alien movies, Transformer movies, and Star Wars. How well is he known for these adaptations? Well, the International Association of Media Tie-in Writers proclaimed him the Grand Master in 2008. In fact, my recommendation is a Star Wars novel, The Splinter in the Mind's Eye, published in 1978. And this one has an interesting history. Farmer wrote the original Star Wars novelization as a ghostwriter. George Lucas was credited as the writer, but he was contracted to write a novel that would be the sequel to Star Wars. George Lucas wanted to make sure that the sequel could be low budget because at the time, no one knew how successful Star Wars would be. So Foster had to make sure that the props that were used in the first movie would be used in the sequel. Of course, Star Wars became a huge success, and George Lucas could go nuts on a big budget production, so Splinter of the Mind's Eye was abandoned in favor of The Empire Strikes Back. Anyway, Splinter of the Mind's Eye is about Luke Skywalker and Princess Leia. There's no Han Solo because Harrison Ford had not signed a contract for the sequel, so he was left out of the story. Anyway, Luke and Leia crash land on a planet with R2-D2 and C-3PO. There's allegedly a crystal on this planet that can enhance the Force, and proof is in the form of a little shard. Of course, who else is interested in such a crystal? Of course, it's Darth Vader. Now, funny enough, the ending of Splinter of the Mind's Eye is quite similar to the ending in The Empire Strikes Back. I've always liked Splinter of the Mind's Eye, and as sort of an, alternate history of the direction Star Wars might have taken, I think you might find it a really interesting read. C.S. Friedman was born in 1957, and her debut novel came out in 1986 called In Conquest Born, which is a really excellent space opera. But my favorite is the Coldfire trilogy, which begins with Black Sun Rising, published in 1991. This is kind of a genre blend between fantasy and science fiction. It takes place on the planet Erna, which is surrounded by an energy field called the Fae. Humans are affected by this energy field, which can manifest their dreams and nightmares. And that kind of played havoc on the first colonists on the planet, and it shaped the human civilization that evolved over 1,000 years on this planet when the story takes place. The story is about a man named Gerald Tarrant, who has done some really, really dark deeds to control the Fae. He can control this energy field better than anyone else ever. Now again, the fantasy element is fairly strong in this series. I would guess science fiction purists would find this way too magical. But I've always found Friedman's writing literary, really beautiful, so I'm kind of surprised she's not more well-known. But if you like genre blends with a science fiction core, if you like epics, I think you'll love Black Sun Rising. Any science fiction list would have to include this next author because it is William Gibson, the father of cyberpunk. Now, yes, there was cyberpunk before Gibson, and Gibson didn't coin the phrase, but the cyberpunk subgenre really didn't reach the proportions it would become until Neuromancer was published in 1984. Neuromancer has that really gritty, dark tone that I associate with punk. In other words, he puts the punk into cyberpunk, especially when considering the punk movement of the 80s. It's dystopian, but dystopian in an almost anarchic sense rather than totalitarian. There's factions that include governments and corporations and crime syndicates, all of which steamroll the common people. Henry Case is a hacker or console cowboy who was caught stealing in virtual reality and punished by getting his central nervous system fried so he can no longer access virtual reality. He is offered a cure to do a hacking job. And off we go to the races. 2 more novels followed Neuromancer, Count Zero, published in 1986, and my favorite, Mona Lisa Overdrive, published in 1988. But if cyberpunk is your jam, and if you like dark, gritty sci-fi, you've got to read Neuromancer. This is a novel, again, that sparked the cyberpunk movement and shaped the culture. A much more recent author, and the most recent on this list of 10, is Hank Green, born in 1980. Since you're watching me on YouTube, you probably know who he is because he's quite the YouTube personality who, along with his brother John Green, run the Vlogbrothers, which has almost 4 million subscribers. I can only dream. So he's probably much more famous as a YouTuber than a writer, but his debut novel, An Absolutely Remarkable Thing, published in 2018, is absolutely worth picking up. Now, every science fiction booktuber read this before me because science fiction and YouTube, but I was always turned off by the cover. You know me and covers. I still think it's an absolutely horrible cover, but anyway, I finally picked it up, and I thought it was a really good novel. It's about a woman named April May who was the first to discover a Carl, which is a mysterious statue of a samurai that suddenly appears in Manhattan. She posts a video online and goes internet famous, but then more and more Carls appear around the world and governments get involved. The Carls also apparently affect the dreams of people, which come in the form of puzzles that April and her friends work to solve. There's something really surreal about the whole plot, and the writing reflects this. I absolutely recommend An Absolutely Remarkable Thing by Hank Green. Joe Haldeman was born in 1943. His must-read novel is The Forever War, published in 1974, which won the Nebula and Hugo. Haldeman wrote this novel in reaction to Robert Heinlein's Starship Troopers, which Haldeman thought glorified war. Haldeman was drafted for the Vietnam War. He served as a combat engineer, was wounded in combat, received a Purple Heart, and had a little bit of a different perspective than Heinlein. The Forever War is about humanity's war with an alien species known as the Taurans. The main character, William Mandela, is recruited as part of a corps of elite soldiers with high IQs, and they go through brutal training and are shipped off to fight. This is a brilliant, thought-provoking novel filled with allegory and deserves its place as a seminal novel in the science fiction genre. In fact, when Robert Heinlein read it, he said it may be the best future war story I've ever read. Are you going to argue with Heinlein? Oh boy, our next author is Harry Harrison, born in 1925 and died in 2012 at the age of 87. One of his better-known novels is Make Room, Make Room, published in 1966, that was adapted into the film Soylent Green in 1973, one of the greatest science fiction movies ever. Anyway, I did a whole video on his illustrated short story, Planet Story, which I don't recommend unless you're interested in the artwork. Speaking of novels written as reactions to Heinlein's Starship Troopers, Harrison wrote Bill the Galactic Hero in 1965, allegedly also in reaction to Starship Troopers, but this book was more of a farce or a parody than Haldeman's Forever War. In fact, Terry Pratchett claimed that Bill the Galactic Hero was the funniest science fiction novel ever written, funnier than The Hitchhiker's Guide. But the novel I recommend is my favorite of Harrison's books, The Stainless Steel Rat, the first book published in 1961 about James Bolivar DeGrees, a.k.a. Slippery Jim, a.k.a. the Stainless Steel Rat, who lives in the far future and is a con man and a thief. The rat is recruited to be a spy for the galactic government. This book and the sequels are all about Slippery Jim's outrageous spy adventures. They're funny and fun and showcases Harrison's tongue-in-cheek writing that has made him a legend in the sci-fi community. Last is the author who I've already mentioned twice, Robert A. Heinlein, born in 1907 and died in 1988 at the age of 80. I've done several videos on Heinlein already. He's one of the big three authors of his time, along with Arthur C. Clarke and Isaac Asimov. I'd argue he was the most famous and successful during the 60s and 70s at least. He's kind of controversial now for his allegedly pro-military stance and idealized female characters, but what I can't get over since I've done videos on Heinlein is how much he has influenced a certain generation of science fiction readers, and I include myself in that. I read Heinlein when I was very young in the 1970s, and his writing had a big impact on me. I don't think new readers today can really understand how much of an impact Stranger in a Strange Land had on those who read it during the 60s and 70s and maybe into the 80s. Stranger was the first science fiction novel ever to reach the New York Times bestseller list, and which the Library of Congress listed as one of the novels that shaped America. So when you read it, you have to kind of read it with the understanding of the time it was published, 1961. Back then, it was considered one of the most groundbreaking novels ever written. Do you grok? For recommendations, however, I'm going to say start with Heinlein's Juveniles-like Citizen of the Galaxy, about an orphan sold as a slave on a backwoods planet and rises up to challenge the galactic system. I've done a whole video ranking the Heinlein Juveniles. Check it out. All those books, in my opinion, are worth reading. We're starting off with a big name, Frank Herbert. Herbert was born in 1920 and died in 1986 at the age of 65. Of course, we will have to talk about his seminal novel, Dune, but this book did not suddenly appear out of thin air in 1965 when it was first published as a novel. Herbert was actually a writer in the golden age of science fiction, publishing in the pulp magazines, Astounding, Amazing, Fantastic, and so on, since the 1940s. Dune is actually a fix-up of two serialized stories published separately in Analog magazine. When it was published in 1965 as a novel, it won the inaugural Hugo Award for Best Novel. Yes, that means it was the first Hugo ever awarded. It's the story of Paul Atreides, born on the lush planet of Caladan, but destined to be the leader on the planet Arrakis, also known as Dune, the source of spice, which allows interstellar travel and psychic visions. Herbert crafted this story to explore environmentalism and ecology and to warn against religious messiahs. Now, I don't believe a sequel was ever planned, but after winning the Hugo and following its huge popularity, Herbert followed Dune up with two sequels that I think are also worth reading, Dune Messiah and Children of Dune. This is a perfect trilogy in my opinion, but Herbert went on continuing the saga with a few more books. I read the fourth book, God, Emperor of Dune, but after that I was like, I'm good. I don't need to read anymore. It's been adapted as a movie several times. I actually like the 1984 David Lynch version, but the recent films by Denis Villeneuve with Timothée Chalamet as Paul Atreides has been very well received and gotten a lot of acclaim, even though I had a few issues with the movie. Moving on, Donna Barba Higuera is a contemporary author of children's books, who I am excited to include in this list because how are new sci-fi writers born? They often come from picking up novels aimed at the juvenile readers, like Robert Heinlein's Juveniles, or Madeleine L'Engle's Wrinkle in Time, or Lois Lowry's The Giver. And trust me, I'm trying to break into the juvenile market and say with some authority there aren't many science fiction novels published these days aimed at kids, but Higuera has broken through with The Last Quintista, published in 2021. It's about a group of people lucky enough to escape the dying Earth aboard these huge ships bound to colonize a planet that can support a human population, but everyone has to go into stasis. One of those is 13-year-old Petra, who remains conscious for part of the journey and listens to stories someone has downloaded into her tank. She also becomes aware that something weird is going on with the crew that's awake that runs the ship, going through some sort of rebellion, revolution, something. Anyway, when she wakes up hundreds of years later, a dystopian totalitarian government is in charge of the colonists, and many of those deemed potentially rebellious have been purged. That is, they're dead, including Petra's mother and father, and all the knowledge of old Earth that's deemed dangerous, jettisoned as well. Quintista means storyteller, and Petra is the last one alive who knows the stories. Are there still good science fiction stories getting published for kids? Read The Last Quintista and get back to me. Moving on from a modern writer of science fiction to a very early writer, we come to Aldous Huxley, the English author born in 1894 and died in 1963 at the age of 69. He was not a very prolific writer, and most of his novels aren't really well known, except for one, Brave New World, published in 1932, which really has become the grandfather to all modern dystopian novels. Orwell's 1984 was published over a decade later, and I think the novel holds up today. Even though its depiction of women is a little dated. The story is set in a far future London where a totalitarian government oversees babies being born in artificial wombs, and it keeps the population under control through the use of a drug called Soma. One man, Bernard, is a bit of a free-thinking rebel who visits New Mexico, which has a reservation for savages, which means people born wild and not civilized. He takes one of the savages, a man named John, back to London. Can John, who has grown up wild and free, survive in the civilized world? It's a pretty bleak book, but if you are a fan of the dystopian subgenre, you should read the novel that started it all. Moving back to the 21st century, let's talk about Kazuo Ishiguro, born in Japan in 1954 and raised in Britain. His first name, Kazuo, always gives me pause because my mother's name is a female version, Kazuko. Anyway, Ishiguro is a literary writer, nominated 4 times for the Book Award. He won once for Remains of the Day, published in 1989, and he also won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2017. The science fiction novel I want to talk about is Never Let Me Go, published in 2005. If you haven't read this already or know the story, I'm not going to say much about it because I went into reading it blind without knowing much about what it was about, and it had a pretty strong impact on me. So I want you to do the same. I'll only say it is set in near contemporary times, and it's about a girl named Kathy who grows up in a school for special children, not really knowing why they are special. That's it. That's all you need to know. Pick up a copy and read Never Let Me Go. The next author is what I would call a writer to watch out for, a rising star. Her name is Emily Jane, and she doesn't even have a Wikipedia page yet, but from her website, we know she went to law school in San Francisco and now lives in Cincinnati. Her debut novel blew me away, On Earth as It Is on Television, published in 2023. The writing is quirky, the story is humorous and a little surreal. It's about first contact with aliens, and we follow the effect with an eclectic group of characters, a man who just wakes up from a coma, the husband of a supermom, a teenage girl filled with ennui, and cats. Yes, cats. If you want to have a fun time, check out On Earth as It Is on Television. I am sure everyone knows N.K. Jemisin by now. Jemisin was born in 1972 and was a practicing psychologist before becoming a full-time writer. She's one of those writers I like to think I found because I picked up her debut novel, The 100,000 Kingdoms, in 2010. This was a novel in a fantasy series known as the Inheritance Trilogy, but her next trilogy was science fiction and is already a classic. I'm talking about the Broken Earth trilogy that starts with the 5th season, published in 2015, followed by The Obelisk Gate in 2016, and then The Stone Sky in 2017. This is the only trilogy where all 3 books won the Hugo. All 3! Oh, an interesting little factoid is this amazing and acclaimed and popular series you'd think would have made Jemisin rich. Well, the advance she got for each book was $25,000. That sparked a lot of conversation of what, or more pointedly, why publishing would give such a low advance. Could it have anything to do that Jemisin was a Black woman? Questions were asked. Anyway, these books are about a far future Earth where there is a 5th season of extreme climate change that literally shakes the world. We follow the storylines of several characters until we reach the jaw-dropping conclusion. Some people call this fantasy. I call it science fiction. I'm sure it's a genre blend of some sort, but it's not one you want to miss out on. I have to thank one of my followers, Evie, for this next one. Thank you, Evie. Simon Jimenez is a Filipino-American born in 1989. The first novel I read was his 2022 fantasy novel, The Spear Cut Through Water, and I admired the risks he took in this unconventional storytelling, and I liked its literary style, but just for me, the structure of the story threw me out of being able to suspend my disbelief. Anyway, I hesitated to read his 2020 debut novel, The Vanished Birds, but I am so glad I did. The novel was, or is, a masterpiece. It's divided into 3 parts and kind of reads like 3 separate novellas, each with a different point of view character, but they are so tightly integrated that it's like reading a full trilogy. Part 1 is about a backwoods planet and a man named Kada who grows from child to adult and is obsessed with this woman, space merchant named Nia, who arrives at his planet for trade every decade or so and never seems to age. When a spaceship lands on the planet and a mysterious child survives, he gives the child to Nia, who raises him on her ship. And that's part 2. The third part is about a woman named Fumiko Nakajima, who is so ancient she spends most of her time in stasis and has an interest in this foundling. Each part has its own literary style. It is a remarkable work, and I strongly urge you to check out The Vanished Birds. Here's a name I bet you don't know. Kay Kenyon, born in 1956 and has been publishing since 1997. She is one of those great science fiction authors that seems to fly under the radar. Though a couple of her standalones have been nominated for awards, Maximum Ice was a 2003 Philip K. Dick Award nominee. The Braided World was a 2003 John Campbell Award nominee. But the series I read that I think is absolutely terrific is a series called The Entire and the Rose, which starts with Bright in the Sky, published in 2007. This is a story of a starship pilot, Titus Quinn, whose wife and daughter are presumed dead. But Titus doesn't think so. He thinks they are lost in a parallel dimension. In fact, he woke up on a far-flung moon raving about his wife and daughter. Everyone thinks he's mad. That is, until a sapient machine of the Minerva Corporation finds a tunnel to another dimension. Now they're knocking on Titus Quinn's door. The writing is smooth, the story is intense, and I think more people should know about the entire And the Rose series by Kay Kenyon. Here's one I bet many of you have already read. Ernest Cline was born in 1972, and his debut novel, Ready Player One, published in 2011, instantly became a classic. It takes place in a near-future dystopia where pollution, poverty, overpopulation has taken a toll on the planet that's now suffering from intense climate change. Life in the real world is not good, which is why everyone escapes to the virtual world of Oasis. When the creator of Oasis, James Halliday, dies, he leaves control of Oasis to the person who can solve a puzzle in the virtual world that he embedded in the game. What makes this such a fun read, especially if you're of a certain age, is all the references to Dungeons & Dragons, classic video games. Everything is spread throughout the Oasis. Steven Spielberg adapted this into a movie which did okay in the box office. I enjoyed it, but it wasn't what I would call a Spielberg classic. But if you like cyberpunk, gaming, virtual reality, and 80s references, I think you'll love Ready Player One by Ernest Cline. We end here with Muir Lafferty, who was born in 1973 and has been a successful award-winning podcaster since 2004. But before that, she was a writer for White Wolf and other role-playing games, which I find very interesting. She's been writing novels since 2007, but I found her with Station Eternity, published in 2022, which I picked for Shelve It or Shove It, because it has this amazing retro science fiction cover. This is a genre blend between cozy detective mysteries and science fiction. It's the first in a series called The Mid-Solar Murders, kind of like Midsummer Murders. Get it? Get it? Each novel is a standalone with a different mystery to solve, like a Miss Marple or Hercule Poirot or Nero Wolfe, but set in space. Our detective is Mallory Viridian, who seems to always be around when someone gets murdered. And she seems to have this preternatural ability to solve the murders. Makes her a great detective, right? Well, not to the police, who begin to get suspicious that so many murders are occurring around her. So she moves out to a space station, Station Eternity, which is like this Babylon 5 type outpost for different alien species. Anyway, she wants to get as far away from the human race as possible, but of course, trouble and humans seem to follow her everywhere. The next novel, Chaos Terminal, picks up where Station Eternity left off, but with a different mystery to solve, but with that same amazing type of retro cover. We start with a big name, the prolific writer Ursula K. Le Guin, born in 1929 and died in 2018 at the age of 88. Le Guin's first sale was a poem in 1959, and then a few short stories after that. Her first novel was a science fiction novel, Rogue Cannon's World, published in 1966, which was the first in a series of books called The Hainish Cycle, and we'll come back to that. The book that really made her famous was The Wizard of Earthsea, a fantasy novel published in 1968, the first in the Earthsea series, which, by the way, is one of my favorites, and I almost put her in the top 100 fantasy novels, but I think the book she will always be best known for is the science fiction masterpiece, The Left Hand of Darkness, published in 1969. It is also part of the Hainish Cycle, which is the world-building universe Le Guin created and set many of her stories in, like Robert Heinlein's Future History, or Larry Niven's Known Space, or C.J. Cherryh's Alliance Union. The universe of the Hainish Cycle refers to the mysterious first humans who were not from Earth, but from the planet Hain, who seeded the universe with genetic experiments of themselves. So we find planets populated with various permutations of humans, which includes Earth. Hey, Star Trek fans, does this sound familiar? The Left Hand of Darkness is about Earth humans who meet the variation of humans on the planet Gethin, who are ambisexual, can change their gender, and have developed a Taoist-style religion. This book won the Hugo and the Nebula and is now studied in many university courses. Yet another author who explored gender themes is Ann Leckie, born in 1966. Her debut novel, Ancillary Justice, published in 2013, is the first in the Ancillary trilogy that I thought was amazing. It is the only novel to have won the Hugo, the Nebula, and the Arthur C. Clarke Awards. One fascinating aspect of this novel is you never know anyone's sex. Everyone is referred to as she, and this seemingly casual play with pronouns really makes you think hard on what is gender more than any other book I've read. The story is about an AI intelligence of a starship whose starship is destroyed, so the AI intelligence now lives in its ancillary human body and is searching for answers. Now, I'll be completely honest with you. I found the first half of Ancillary Justice a little slow. But after the halfway point, the story really picked up, and then I found I couldn't put that book down, and I couldn't put down any of the remaining books in the trilogy. There's a reason why Leckie has received so many awards and so much praise, and you won't regret finding out why. Tanith Lee is a British science fiction author born in 1947 and died in 2015 at the age of 67. She has written over 90 books and countless short stories. She's won the World Fantasy Award several times and was a Bram Stoker Lifetime Achievement Award winner. Hey, she even wrote a couple of episodes of Blake 7. Since the 1970s, she's written in many different genres and blended many different genres, including adult fantasy, children's fantasy, science fiction, horror, gothic romance, and historical fiction. I first became aware of Tanith Lee in the 80s with her twisted fairy tale retellings, Red as Blood, or Tales from the Sisters Grimmer. The science fiction story she is most known for, and maybe her most famous work, is The Silver Medal Lover, published in 1981. The story is about a robot who, you guessed it, is the object of infatuation of a young woman. Is she falling in love with a real entity that can think and feel, or has she fallen victim to clever programming? The story is more relevant now than ever before, and if you haven't already checked out The Silver Medal Lover, you'll be enthralled by one of the greats of speculative fiction, Tanith Lee. Who hasn't heard of Madeleine L'Engle, born in 1918 and died in 2007 at the age of 88? Her breakout children's novel was A Wrinkle in Time, published in 1962, which went on to win the Newbery Award and has become a staple novel for children of every generation since. Certainly it was for me, and I read it in 5th grade, and it was immediately one of my favorites. It's about 13-year-old Meg and her genius little brother, Charles Wallace, whose father disappeared during some mysterious scientific experiment on something called a tesseract. They meet a woman named Mrs. Whatsit, who seems to know that a tesseract is the ability to fold space and travel to other planets. With her friend Calvin and her little brother, the 3 kids follow Mrs. Whatsit and Mrs. Whatsit's friends, Mrs. Who and Mrs. Witch, across the dimensions to find out what really happened to Meg and Charles Wallace's father. There is a very Christian or religious element to the story, which didn't bother me at the time I read it. I probably didn't even notice it. Ironically, some fundamental Christians have banned the book thinking it promotes witchcraft. I think A Wrinkle in Time stands the test of time, and I'm happy to include it in this list. Staying with children's writers, let's talk about Lois Lowry, born in 1937, who is still active today at the age of 87. She mostly writes books for younger children and wasn't really known for science fiction. That is, not until The Giver was published in 1993 and won the Newbery Award. This story starts off seemingly to show a utopian society in the far future, but then we find out that history has been suppressed, and this is really a dystopian society that ensures everybody is the same and conforms and follows the rules, except for one person, the receiver of memories, who is burdened to be the only one who knows the history of the world. Jonas is a 12-year-old boy who is chosen to be the next receiver of memory. The novel is a warning against a society that censors its children. In another ironic twist, The Giver has itself been censored by certain communities. Arkady Martine was born in 1985 and is a relatively new author you definitely need to watch out for. Her debut novel, A Memory Called Empire, was published in 2019 and won the Hugo. The story is about a woman named Mahit, who is from a far-flung independent republic in the galaxy known as Lascelles Station. She is sent as an ambassador to the Texcalanli Empire, with the goal of keeping Lascelles Station independent and not to be the victim of yet colonization by this empire. To help, she has a memory chip that contains all the memories of past ambassadors to this empire, but something is wrong with this chip, and the previous ambassador may have been murdered. I love the book. It is not a fast-paced shoot-them-up space opera, but it's more of a slow burn. It's a murder mystery and a political thriller. The sequel, A Desolation Called Peace, published in 2021, also won the Hugo, and is about the Empire's clash with an alien race that we first heard rumors of in the first book. Both these books make up the Texcalan series, and both of which I really enjoyed. Anne McCaffrey is another big name in the science fiction world. Born in 1926, she died in 2011 at the age of 85, having written over 100 books. She is the first woman to win the Hugo and the first woman to win the Nebula. She began publishing short stories starting in the 1950s, and her first novel, Dragonflight, published in 1968, was a fix-up of stories she wrote in the world of Pern. Now, because most of the Pern novels have the word dragon in it, people jump to the conclusion that they are fantasy novels, but they are science fiction. Human colonists have settled on the world of Pern and formed a partnership with the alien inhabitants there called dragons. Dragons look like mythical dragons and can breathe fire. Pern suffers from something called threadfall, which are spores from space that occasionally rain down on Pern and decimates organic life. In fact, thread has destroyed much of the advanced technology of the human settlers, but humans have learned to telepathically bond with dragons, which can fight thread by burning it with their dragon breath. My favorite of the Pern novels is The White Dragon, published in 1978, about a boy named Jackson, who comes of age and bonds with Ruth, who, unlike other dragons, is pure white and is also the runt of the dragon population. If you haven't read Anne McCaffrey, you can't go wrong with The White Dragon or any of the Pern novels. Vonda McIntyre was born in 1948 and died in 2019 at the age of 70. She was first published in 1975 with her novel The Exile Waiting. Her second novel, Dream Snake, a fix-up of several of her short stories, was published in 1978 and went on to win the Nebula. Her 1997 novel, The Sun and the Moon, beat Game of Thrones for Best Novel. It's an alternate history of the court of the Sun King, Louis XIV, which has a mermaid you will not forget. I loved reading this one. It doesn't have magic, so maybe it's considered science fiction, but it's really a great book either way. But I want to talk about her Star Trek novels. Yes, we're back to Star Trek. The novel I recommend is The Entropy Effect, published in 1981. This was the first time Sulu and Uhura were given first names. And yes, you can thank Vonda McIntyre that it became canon in the Star Trek universe that Sulu is Hikaru Sulu and Uhura is Nyota Uhura. The story is about the Enterprise transporting a criminal and theoretical physicist named Dr. George Mordreau, who Spock has trouble believing is the murderer everyone claims he is. But when murders start happening and Mordreau is to blame, we have to wonder exactly what theoretical physics Mordreau was studying. This is a great Star Trek adventure and was the novel that convinced the producers of Star Trek to hire her to write the novelizations of the Star Trek movies, The Wrath of Khan, Search for Spock, and The Voyage Home, which comprises what I think is the trilogy of the greatest Star Trek movies to date. I want to talk about one of my absolute favorite young adult authors, Marissa Meyer. Born in 1984, her debut novel, Cinder, was published in 2012. This is so much fun. It is a science fiction retelling of Cinderella, only here, our heroine, Cinder, is a cyborg. She lives with a stepmother and two evil sisters, and you know the story, or do you? Because while it contains the broad strokes of the Cinderella storyline, it's set in a dystopian world with complex politics and a plot that goes far beyond the fairy tale. This is the first book in the Lunar Chronicles, where each book is another fairy tale retelling that goes off the deep end. Scarlet takes on Little Red Riding Hood, Cress subverts the Rapunzel story, and finally Winter concludes the epic science fiction story with a retelling of Snow White. Yes, these novels do have romance subplots, but they don't overshadow the dystopian high adventure. Again, I think they are so much fun. The last author on this list of 10 is James Morrow, born in 1947. Morrow is an award-winning science fiction author, mainly known for his short stories. After winning the Nebula Award for Short Stories in 1988, he was selected by the Science Fiction Writers of America to be the editor for 3 volumes of their anthology of Nebula winners. His writing is known for its satire and absurdist humor, skewering contemporary politics and religion. That's what my recommendation does. This is the Way the World Ends, published in 1986, was marketed as a mainstream fiction, probably because it had this Vonnegut-type feel to it. But the science fiction community, of course, immediately embraced it. It's about a nuclear apocalypse that destroys humanity, but creates a race of ghosts who are potential humans who never got to be born. I know it sounds depressing as heck, but trust me, Morrow's dark humor carries the story, and you never feel overwhelmed by the heavy subject matter. This was written during the Cold War, and it may hit those of us who remember the Cold War a lot harder than those who were born after the fall of the Soviet Union. But even if you are younger, it will educate you on the type of nihilism that existed in the 80s. Tamsin Muir is a New Zealand science fiction author born in 1985 who came out strong, and I mean like gangbusters, in 2019 with Gideon the Ninth. Now, I know that she published some award-winning short stories as early as 2013, but Gideon was her novel debut. And boy, did it get some praise. It was shortlisted for the Hugo, Nebula, and World Fantasy Award. It was on a ton of best books of 2019, including NPR, Vox, and the New York Public Library. Everybody, including me, was thrilled with the tagline, "Lesbian Necromancers in Space." It is the first in a series called The Locked Tomb, which is definitely a genre smash with science fiction, fantasy, horror, and mystery. The star system of Dominicus is run by the Emperor, an immortal necromancer who is super powerful and worshipped like a god. The Emperor is served by representatives of the 9 planets called lectors, each ruled by a house of necromancy, every house practicing their own speciality of necromancy. The first house is the house of the Emperor on the planet Canaan, and all the houses are called to send a representative to possibly become a new lector. One of the Emperor's chosen. Each representative must have a cavalier, or bodyguard, on the 9th house, whose only purpose seems to be to guard this locked tomb. A powerful necromancer named Harrowhawk is chosen, and her cavalier is a woman warrior named Gideon. The two absolutely hate each other, but they arrive on the planet, which seems like it's almost uninhabited, and are dumped into this decaying mansion with the representatives of the other houses. There are mysteries to uncover, and everything turns deadly. The story is told from the first-person point of view of Gideon, and I think it is one of the best character voices I've ever read. She is crude, funny, so funny, and I dare you not to fall in love with Gideon, which is one of the reasons why I was disappointed with the next book in the series, Harrow the Ninth, published in 2020, because we no longer had that wonderful voice of Gideon, and I did not really like Harrow. But also, not only do I think the writing is literary, but in Harrow, I think it is experimental in that Tamsin Muir seems to play around a lot with breaking conventions, which I respect, but I felt the plot, which was really convoluted to begin with, just became really difficult to follow. But the next book in the series, published in 2022, Nona the Ninth, had me back. It was told from the point of view of apparently a child. I found Nona delightful. She reminded me of Flavia de Luce, another of my favorite child characters written for adults. And of course, I cannot wait to read the 4th book, Alecto the Ninth. When does it come out? Is it out already? I think it'll be out soon. Now we turn to one of the biggest names in science fiction, Larry Niven. Born in 1938, he is still active, I believe, at the age of 86. He has been extremely prolific, won all the awards, and was named a Grandmaster by the Science Fiction Writers Association. Niven was one of my favorite science fiction writers during high school, mainly because I found Ringworld, published in 1970, in the school library. I absolutely loved all of his books that I read, set in the known space, and his collaborations with Jerry Pournelle, like Mote in God's Eye, Lucifer's Hammer. Those were amazing. And I loved his recent Fleet of Worlds series, written in collaboration with Edward Lerner, about one of his most incredible alien creations, the Puppeteers. But if you only read one Niven novel, it has got to be the one I started with, Ringworld, which won the Hugo, Nebula, and Locus Awards. It is about a crew gathered together by an alien named Nessus, who is a puppeteer. Puppeteers are a race of abject cowards who are kind of bovine with 2 heads. Nessus recruits 2 humans, an Earthman, Louis Wu, who is hundreds of years old thanks to longevity drugs, and Tila Brown, a very lucky woman. Another member of the crew is Speaker to Animals, an alien who is known as a Kazin, who evolved from giant feline predators. Their mission is to investigate an object the puppeteers discovered in space known as the Ringworld. It is an artificial band about 1 million miles wide that circles the sun. The inside of the band is habitable and, of course, huge. A smaller band of opaque and non-opaque squares rotate to mimic day and night on Ringworld. There are a lot of mysteries to uncover, like who are the people that live on Ringworld, and why was Ringworld abandoned by its creators? Okay, I have to include at least one children's book. The writer is Robert C. O'Brien, born in 1918 and died in 1973 at the young age of 55. He wrote only a handful of children's science fiction books, but one was one of my favorites growing up, Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nim, published in 1971, just 2 years before O'Brien died. But the book went on to win the Newbery and became a very successful animated movie called The Secret of Nim. The story is told from the point of view of animals, which is not my usual go-to, even in children's books, but there are always exceptions, and this is a big exception. It's about a widowed mouse named Mrs. Frisby, whose son is ill and has to be moved. She is eventually led to seek help from a community of super-intelligent rats, also known as the Rats of Nim, who apparently were good friends with Mrs. Frisby's husband. NIM, by the way, stands for National Institute of Mental Health, and if you put 2 and 2 together and think that NIM was conducting experiments on mice and rats, you can guess where the story is heading. It's a shame O'Brien passed away so young, but his daughter, Jane Leslie Conley, carried on her father's legacy, became a children's writer, and wrote 2 well-received sequels, Rasco and the Rats of Nim, published in 1986, and Artie, Margaret, and the Rats of Nim, published in 1990. We have to put on our serious hat for the next author because it is George Orwell. Orwell was born in 1903 and died of tuberculosis in 1950 at the super young age of 46. That's really young. I was a big fan when I found him during high school, and I read a lot of his works, including his first book, Down and Out in Paris and London. If you're going to restaurants, by the way, don't read this book. His 2 most famous novels are Animal Farm, published in 1945, which, like Mrs. Frisby, is from the point of view of animals, but it's really a satire and allegory about how the good intentions of communism can give rise to brutal dictatorships. It's basically about the Soviet Union. But, of course, his most famous novel is 1984, published in 1949. This is one of those stories that defined the subgenre of dystopian novels. And it is brutal to read. There's no happy endings here. It also turned Orwell's name into an adjective. When someone says Orwellian future, we know they mean a dystopian future where the government, Big Brother, controls everything, even how you think, even changing history and the meaning of words to shape the thoughts of the citizens. That's what the main character, Winston Smith, tries to push against, but the brutality and machinery of the government stamp him down. The year 1984 has come and gone, but what's the novel 1984? Prescient. Ed Park is a Korean-American writer born in 1970 in Buffalo, New York. One of my livestream followers, Hi Cappuccino, introduced me to his book, Same Bed, Different Dreams, published in 2023. The book was a Pulitzer Prize finalist, so yeah, it is safe to assume it is literary, but it is also experimental. Like I said about Tamsin Muir's second book, experimental means the author plays around with the plot and often breaks normal storytelling conventions. It can be very exciting, but it can also be very hard to read. So I will tell you right off that I almost DNF'd this book, at least at the beginning, because I got frustrated with how it was split between different storylines and timelines that didn't seem to connect. But I am so glad I stuck with it because it eventually pays off. And if you can get through, I don't know, the first 20, 30% of the novel, it does pick up and make more sense. It's about, gosh, what is it about? It's about the Provisional Korean Government, which was created after Japan occupied Korea in 1919. There is so much detailed history in this that I didn't know about Korea, And there's this also wild secret history that may or may not be true. So it's really hard to distinguish between what is and isn't. And it has a bunch of cultural references from MASH to K-pop. I actually recommend reading this on a Kindle or an ebook where you can highlight the words or names and call up a Wikipedia entry, because I found myself doing that a lot. And if you are willing to take the journey, it is well worth the trip. Steve Perry was born in 1947. He didn't just write books, but he wrote for television and is still writing today at the age of 77. He's been fairly prolific, writing many IP works like for Star Wars, Shadows of the Empire, published in 1996, or Aliens, Aliens Earthhive, published in 1992, or Aliens vs. Predator, like Prey, published in 1994. Like Robert Jordan, he wrote a lot of Conan novels in the 80s, starting with Conan the Fearless in 1986. But what I know him for is the Matador series, which started with The Man Who Never Missed, published in 1985. It's about a man named Emil Kadaji, who's sort of this, Han Solo type rogue who joins the Matadors, the rebellion against the Confed Space Empire. Emil deserted the Empire's military and becomes a legend, shooting over 2,000 soldiers and never missing, making him feared by the Empire. This is super popcorn, candy, James Bond type science fiction that is short, punchy, and fast to read. My favorite of the series is The Albino Knife, published in 1991, about Emil's daughter, Veet, who is just as deadly. If you like space opera and military sci-fi, you can't go wrong with the Matador series. Let's go back to the golden age of science fiction with Frederik Pohl. Pohl was born in 1919 and died in 2013 at the age of 93. He first published in 1937 with a poem called Elegy to a Dead Satellite, Luna. He was named Grandmaster by the Science Fiction Writers Association in 1993 and has won a total of 4 Hugos and 3 Nebulas. Now, the novel I recommend, and probably his most famous work, was published late in his career when he was in his late 50s. That's Gateway, published in 1977. The story is from the point of view of a man named Broadhead, who is basically talking to his AI-generated psychologist named Siegfried von Schrink. And he's relating events through psychoanalysis to Siegfried in order to break through a memory block. Broadhead is one of the lucky few who won a lottery and uses the money to see whether piloting an alien spaceship will kill him or not. Let me explain. There was an alien race called the Heechee who lived aeons ago and are now extinct, but they left behind some high-tech ships surrounding this asteroid they're calling Gateway. And there's about 1,000 alien ships that no one really knows where they go or how to control it. The Gateway Corporation oversees test runs on these ships to see if they lead to either star systems with really valuable Heechee artifacts or to certain death. Who knows? You could die horribly or become rich beyond imagination or something in between. Broadhead becomes one of these test pilots and eventually becomes part of a crew that ends up going to a black hole. This book really amazed me when I first read it in the 70s. It definitely can be read as a standalone. I'm pretty sure it was written as a standalone, but Pohl followed up with 5 sequels, and I recommend the next 2, where you can find out more about the Heechee, Beyond the Blue Event Horizon, published in 1980, and Heechee Rendezvous, published in 1984. But again, you can read Gateway as a standalone. I already mentioned this next author, Jerry Pournelle, born in 1933 and died in 2017 at the age of 84. Now, I selected Pournelle maybe as a way to talk more about Larry Niven, but Pournelle has written some really good, hard, military science fiction. I actually was going to talk about The Mercenary, this book, but after looking it up, it apparently doesn't exist anymore. It's now part of The Prince, which is the complete saga of Falkenberg's Legion. But really my recommendation is his collaborations with Larry Niven. All of them are great, especially Lucifer's Hammer, published in 1977, which is a post-apocalyptic novel about an asteroid named Lucifer's Hammer hitting the Earth. And Inferno, published in 1976, which is this weird fantasy about hell based on Dante's Inferno, about an agnostic science fiction writer who dies trying to entertain his fans and ends up in Dante's Inferno. But my favorite has got to be The Mote in God's Eye, published in 1974, set in Pournelle's universe where the United States and Soviet Union have combined into a world government. It's about a starship sent to investigate the Mote, the name of a yellow star that religious fanatics called the Mote in God's Eye. There, they come into first contact with a really interesting alien race that they call the Motes. This is such a good book. Heinlein called it the finest science fiction novel he ever read. It is a science fiction classic that everyone that I know who's read it has loved it. Let's talk about Mike Resnick, born in 1942 and died in 2020 at the age of 77. I'm always surprised that more people haven't heard of Resnick, but he's written more than 70 novels and 25 collections. He's also won 5 Hugo Awards and a Nebula. One of his most famous novels is Santiago, published in 1986 about a galactic bounty hunter looking for the legendary criminal Santiago, which highlights the humor in Resnick's work. But what I want to recommend is his Oracle trilogy, which starts with Soothsayer, published in 1991, about Penelope Bailey, a girl born who can foresee the future, and everyone in the galaxy either wants to exploit her or kill her. Penelope is saved by a woman called Mouse, who is a cynical thief. You should read the whole trilogy, which shouldn't take too long because the books are pretty short. Each book is a different stage of Penelope's life. Soothsayer is Penelope as a young girl. Then Oracle, published in 1992, is Penelope as a young woman. Finally, Prophet, published in 1993, is Penelope when she is mature. I want everyone to read this series. It is top drawer science fiction. Finally, we conclude this group of 10 with Kim Stanley Robinson. Robinson was born in 1952 and is still active today at the age of 72. He received a doctorate in English literature in 1982 from the University of California, San Diego, and his thesis was The Novels of Philip K. Dick. He's won many awards, including the Hugo and Nebula. His first novel was The Wild Shore, published in 1984, the first in a trilogy about possible futures of California, also known as the Three Californias trilogy. But what Robinson is well known for is his climate fiction, also associated with solar punk, with the publication of Red Mars, published in 1992, about the colonization of Mars. Green Mars, published in 1993, focuses on the terraforming of Mars. And finally, Blue Mars, published in 1996, about what happens after Mars has been successfully terraformed. The Mars trilogy has become a classic science fiction solar punk trilogy that you should definitely check out. Last time we left off with a Robinson, Kim Stanley Robinson. Now we're going to pick up with another Robinson, Spider Robinson. Spider Robinson is a Canadian author born in 1948. Although he was originally born in America, he was a Canadian citizen for most of his life. He's won 3 Hugos and a Nebula. He started off with the publication of a short story titled The Guy with the Eyes in the February 1973 edition of Analog magazine. That story, his first story, was set in a bar called Callahan's Place. Fast forward to 1977, and we have the publication of an anthology called Callahan's Crosstime Saloon. Now, I don't usually recommend short story anthologies, but like I frequently say, there's always an exception. If you want whimsical, funny, raunchy, ridiculous stories, you can't go wrong visiting Callahan's Bar and meeting time travelers, an ethical vampire, a talking dog, extraterrestrials, and all manner of wacky customers. And if you want more, Robinson produced several more anthologies and full-length novels about Callahan's Crosstime Saloon. Another interesting fact about Robinson is that he was chosen by the Heinlein estate to write Variable Star, published in 2006, which is a novel based on an outline that Heinlein wrote in 1955 but never finished himself. Mary Rosenblum is an author that not many people know, but they should. She was born in 1952 and died suddenly in 2006 at the age of 65 in an accident while piloting a single-engine plane over the state of Washington. Her debut was in science fiction with The Drylands, published in 1993, which won the Compton Award for Best First Novel. In 1999, she started a series of cozy mysteries under the pen name Mary Freeman with Devil's Trumpet, whose amateur sleuth is a landscaper named Rachel O'Connor. My recommendation is a little-known gem called The Stone Garden, published in 1994. It's about these mysterious asteroids that attract a special kind of artist who then carves the stone into sculptures that give off emotions. But then the sculptors start getting brutally murdered, and the remaining sculptors have to figure out the mystery fast before they are targeted next. By the way, Mary Rosenblum's books are really hard to find. They are not available as ebooks, so you have to hunt down used copies at used bookstores or eBay or something, but trust me, it'll be worth it. Joanna Russ was born in 1937 and died in 2011 at the age of 74. Russ was first and foremost a feminist, so it should be no surprise that she wrote the seminal premier feminist science fiction novel, The Female Man, in 1975. I think this should be required reading for any science fiction fan who calls themselves a feminist or who supports the feminist movement. It follows the lives of 4 women from 4 parallel universes. Joanna, which is, of course, a stand-in for the author Joanna Russ, who exists in our world in, of course, the 1970s when the novel was written. Then there's Janine, who lives in a world where the Great Depression never ended and World War II never happened, so women never joined the workforce and are stuck in stereotypical gender roles. Janet is from the utopia of While Away, where men were killed by a plague, so only women exist. And finally, there's Jael, who is from a dystopia where men and women are literally at war. The 4 women are versions of the same woman, are able to visit each other and grow from their interactions. It's a short novel, so it's a quick read, but it is dense with ideas and a touchstone for feminist fiction. Fred Saberhagen was born in 1930 and died in 2007 at the age of 77. He began his science fiction writing career by publishing short stories as early as 1961. While developing as a writer, he was an editor for the Encyclopedia Britannica for its chemistry articles from 1967 to 1973. He became a full-time author in 1975 and was very prolific, including a series of novels from Dracula's point of view, which starts with The Dracula Tape, published in 1975. But what I recommend is his epic space opera that starts with Berserker, published in 1967. The first novel is a fix-up of several of Saberhagen's short stories about Berserker machines, which are remnants of doomsday weapons left over from an intergalactic war that has long since passed, and humans are left to encounter these self-replicating machines of destruction. They're kind of like the anti-Bob from Dennis Taylor's Bobiverse. Over the years, Saberhagen followed up with well over a dozen Berserker novels and anthologies, which also spawned a board game. If you read science fiction today, you probably know who John Scalzi is. Scalzi was born in 1969 and has won or been nominated for many awards, including the Hugo, the Nebula, the Locust, and many others. He released his first novel, Agent of the Stars, on his website in 1997 and offered it for free in 1999. His first traditionally published novel was the military sci-fi novel Old Man's War, published in 2005 with a 75-year-old protagonist, which became the first in a series of novels about the old man. Scalzi is known for his humor and his wit. My recommendation is Starter Villain, published in 2023, because look at the cover. I picked it for Shelf It or Shove It. It's about an everyman loser named Charlie who is down on his luck and scrapes by with his cats. Suddenly, he inherits his estranged uncle's parking garage business. But surprise, he finds out it's a front for a supervillain business, complete with a secret volcano island lair and super intelligent cats who are the administrators or something. I think Starter Villain works with Scalzi's humor and such a ridiculous plot. Robert Silverberg was born in 1935 and is still active today at the age of 89. He's won multiple Hugos and Nebulas and is a grandmaster of science fiction. He's attended every single Hugo Award ceremony since 1953. His first novel was a juvenile sci-fi novel, Revolt on Alpha C, published in 1955, which won him his first Hugo as Best New Writer. He went on to a very distinguished career in science fiction, writing and editing over 500 books. You heard me right, 500! My favorite Silverberg novel is Lord Valentine's Castle, published in 1980, which was originally serialized in the magazine of science fiction and fantasy. In this novel, we are introduced to Magipore, a backwater planet populated by humans and aliens. Valentine has lost his memory, so of course he joins a traveling troupe of jugglers. Slowly, he begins realizing that something is really off about this world. I think this is a really fun book. Clifford D. Simak is another distinguished science fiction writer, but somehow he never got quite as famous as his peers. Simak was born in 1904 and died in 1988 at the age of 83. He got his start during the Golden Age science fiction, publishing short stories as early as 1931. He was named a Grandmaster of Science Fiction in 1977 and was very prolific, winning 3 Hugos and a Nebula, and was best friends with Isaac Asimov. He is known as a pioneer of a subgenre called pastoral science fiction. That is, science fiction stories in rural settings. He's probably best known for City, published in 1952, a fix-up novel about an extinct species known as humans, as told by dogs. But I'm going to recommend a strange little book he wrote in 1976 called Shakespeare's Planet, which wasn't well received, but I thought it was amazing. Maybe there's no accounting for taste. It's about a space traveler named Carter Horton, who is in deep sleep as his ship searches for a colony planet for humans. He wakes up to find he's the only one of the crew left alive. The 3 other crew members are now disembodied minds of the ship, known as the Monk, the Scientist, and the Grand Dam. They arrive at a planet that could be suitable, but there's an alien that lives there named Carnivore, who claims that a human was there before named Shakespeare. The novel doesn't have a traditional plot. There's a lot of dialogue and philosophy and rumination, but darn it, I still think it's one of Simak's best works. Dan Simmons was born in 1948 and is still active today at the age of 76. He started writing short stories in the 80s, and his mentor was Harlan Ellison. They also both shared the same agent. Although he also writes horror, such as Summer of Night, published in 1991, he is best known for the science fiction series that starts with Hyperion, published in 1989, and won the Hugo. The series is called the Hyperion Cantos, which makes sense because it's inspired and structured like the Canterbury Tales. It's a frame story about a group of pilgrims, each telling their own tale. The pilgrimage is on the world of Hyperion, which houses the time tombs where the Shrike lives, a mechanical demigod, sort of, that allegedly can grant wishes. This is set in the far future where humanity is connected through high-tech portals so they can travel between worlds. The hegemony of man lives uneasily next to the Technocore, a civilization of AIs. Hyperion is on almost everyone's list of top sci-fi novels, including mine. Have you ever heard of Cordwainer Smith? That's the pseudonym of Paul Linebarger, who was born in 1913 and died in 1966 at the very young age of 53. His first story was published in a high school magazine in 1928 called War Number 81Q, which can be found on Project Gutenberg. But he didn't really start his writing career until the 1950s when he began selling short stories to the science fiction pulp magazines. Most of his stories are set in a universe he created called the Instrumentality of Mankind. So I picked up probably his most famous novel because of the wackadoodle cover, Norstrilia, published in 1975. You may notice this was published posthumously. He died in 1966. It's a fix-up of two novels published in the early 60s. Norstrilia is the contraction of a planet named after Old North Australia, Norstrilia. Norstrilia is the only planet that produces Stroon, an anti-aging drug. So it is the wealthiest planet in the galaxy, which lets their human inhabitants preserve their archaic way of life as Australian ranchers, because they raise a special type of mutant sheep that produces the Stroon. Roderick is one of the heirs to one of these old Norstrilian families and must develop his telepathic powers before someone kills him. We end this group of 10 with Norman Spinrad. Spinrad was born in 1940 and is active today at the age of 84. His first novel was a space opera called The Solarians, published in 1966. His next novel was Bug Jack Barron, published in 1969, which caused a bit of a controversy at the time because it was funded by the British Arts Council, and a member of Parliament didn't like the book and didn't think it should be funded, either because of the explicit language or maybe because of its cynical view of politicians. Spinrad wrote the script for the original Star Trek episode The Doomsday Machine, which was nominated for a Hugo. But the novel I recommend is very strange. Maybe it's offensive, I don't know. But it was so weird, it left an indelible stamp on my memory. It's called The Void Captain's Tale, published in 1983. The premise is that in the far future, ships can travel through the void, which is basically a form of hyperspace. Pilots are women with psychic powers who experience powerful orgasms when they travel through the void. The story is about the captain of one of the ships who is infatuated with his pilot, and that pilot wants to be free of everything, including her body. The story is as strange as it sounds, maybe not for everyone, but one that you won't forget. Christopher Stasheff was born in 1944 and died in 2018 at the age of 74. His most famous novel is his debut novel, and the one I recommend, The Warlock in Spite of Himself, published in 1969. This is a science fiction list, right? Why, yes it is. Despite the title, The Warlock in Spite of Himself, this is a science fiction novel. The title is a twist on the Molière play The Doctor in Spite of Himself. It is about an interstellar agent named Rod Gallaglass, who is on a mission to make sure the planet Greymere develops into a democracy, and he has to stop some corrupt secret galactic organizations from interfering. Oh, And if you didn't catch when this was written, it was written during the Vietnam War, and it is a commentary about the proper use of government and democracy. Anyway, Grey Mare is in a medieval stage of development, and people on Grey Mare mistake Rod Galglass's technology as magic and call him a warlock. The story is actually really funny. Rod is accompanied by an epileptic robot horse. He defeats a werewolf with garlic sausage. It is a short, light, humorous read, and it has spawned a dozen sequels and several spin-off series. Neal Stephenson was born in 1959 and is still active today at the age of 64. Now, I thought Stevenson's debut novel was Snow Crash, published in 1992, which is where I first heard of him. So imagine my surprise at finding out his debut was published in 1984 called Big U. Yeah, Big U. If you can't tell from the cover, it is a satire about campus life. Stevenson was not proud of that book and tried to pretend it didn't exist, but eventually people found it after the success of Snow Crash, and he reluctantly allowed it to be republished. Of course, for this list, we are going to talk about Snow Crash. One thing Snow Crash has with Big U is a satirical sense of humor. It is a cyberpunk novel that kind of revived cyberpunk when it was released, and it became a bestseller. The first name of the main character is Hiro. That's spelled like the Japanese first name, Hiro, and the last name is protagonist. So yes, the main character is Hiro, protagonist. He delivers pizza for the mafia, and he is a freelance hacker on the side. In the virtual reality world of the metaverse, he runs across a data file called Snow Crash, which maybe it's a drug or maybe it has links to ancient civilizations. It's a bit of a cipher. And Hiro and his partner, a woman named YT, that stands for yours truly, are thrust into a conspiracy of cyber religions and a conspiracy to reprogram the human race. When this book was first published, I was living in San Francisco, and I was around a lot of virtual reality pioneers, and they went absolutely gaga for Snow Crash, and it has influenced a lot of virtual reality today. It is now a classic, and Time magazine named Snow Crash one of the 100 all-time best modern English language novels. I was introduced to this next author thanks to my followers on my live streams, and that is Dennis E. Taylor. Taylor is a Canadian science fiction author, mainly known for a series of books called The Bobiverse. The first book in the series, and Taylor's first novel, was originally self-published in 2015, titled We Are Legion, in parens, We Are Bob. He then tried to get it published by a traditional publishing house, but no one would take it. So Taylor's literary agent published it through their in-house agency publishing arm, and it went on to become an audiobook that was awarded the best science fiction audiobook of the year. It has since gained a cult following, and the fourth Bobiverse book, Heaven's River, was on the New York Times bestsellers list. Now, after hearing about the series, I thought it was going to be a very satirical comedy just because of the name. Bobiverse. We are Bob. And there is some humor in the books, but nothing that I would really call satire. So in that respect, I think it is more serious than the titles make you expect. It is about a computer entrepreneur named Bob who dies sometimes in contemporary times right after he becomes successful, so he never gets to enjoy his success. But his brain pattern is resurrected to be used as an artificial intelligence to run a space probe. So when he is resurrected, it is in the far future, and Earth is divided into factions, and the faction that is using Bob's brain pattern is located in North America, and they're governed by religious zealots. Anyway, the probe is shot into space, and Bob has more freedom than expected, and he self replicates. This is known as a von Neumann probe, and it's a real theoretical concept developed by a Hungarian-American physicist, and it's been used in science fiction novels before. You may remember I talked about it with Fred Saberhagen's Berserker Machines. Anyway, as Bob replicates, he begins naming his offspring after pop cultural references that he knows. Everything from Star Trek to The Simpsons to Garfield and other comic strips. Of course, his offspring make offspring. And there's a whole interesting philosophical discourse underlying the entire Bobiverse on what constitutes consciousness. Because each iteration of Bob is unique and a little bit different. And the Bob's self-appointed grand purpose? To save the human race, mostly from themselves. Another modern writer is Adrian Tchaikovsky, a British science fiction author, born in 1972 and very much active today. In fact, he is also quite prolific, starting with his debut novel, Empire of Black and Gold, published in 2008, which went on to become a 10-book series. Since then, he went on to write 5 trilogies, several standalone novels, as well as novellas and short stories, winning several awards, including the Arthur C. Clarke and the Hugo. My favorite series is The Final Architecture, which starts with Shards of Earth, published in 2021. The story takes place after the Earth has been destroyed by these moon-sized aliens known as architects. The architects find planets with sentient life and carve them up like big works of art. There was a war with the architects where humans developed these surgically altered people called intermediaries who are somehow psionic, maybe, or have opened their minds and are able to fight or communicate with the architects. And they are the only beings that can freely travel in hyperspace. The story is about one of these intermediaries, a man named Idris, and the humans and aliens around him that take us on a really intense journey to discover more about the architects. You'll definitely want to plan on reading the entire trilogy, which continues with Eyes of the Void, published in 2022, and finishes with Lords of Uncreation, published in 2023. Let's go back to the golden age of science fiction because we're going to talk about Jack Vance. Vance was born in 2016 and died in 2013 at the age of 96. He won multiple Hugo Awards and was named a Grand Master of Science Fiction in 1991 and was inducted into the Science Fiction Hall of Fame in 2001. Like most science fiction writers of the Golden Age, he started writing short stories, debuting with the short story The World Thinker, published in Thrilling Wonder Stories in 1945. Now, I recommend his most famous collection of short stories, The Dying Earth, first published in 1950. It's a collection of short stories linked together in the same universe. Now, this has a very fantasy feel to it. There are magicians and spells and stuff like that, but everything magic is explained to be based on higher science or mathematics. But it does give the stories a sort of mystical quality. As the title implies, the stories are set in Earth's final days, the dying Earth, when the sun is red and dimming and everyone knows the end is near. So the characters are very nihilistic and existential. The Dying Earth is considered a classic and has influenced many people, including Gary Gygax, for his original Dungeons & Dragons. If you play Dungeons & Dragons and have heard of Ion Stones, you can thank Jack Vance's Dying Earth for that and more. John Varley was born in 1947 and is active today at the age of 77. He has won multiple Hugo and Nebula Awards, and his writing style has been compared to Robert Heinlein's. His debut novel was The Avicii Hotline, published in 1977. I really enjoyed his 1983 novel Millennium, which became what I thought was a good time travel movie in 1989, though I don't think it was very well received. Anyway, Varley wrote one of my favorite trilogies of all time called the Gaia Trilogy, which starts with Titan, published in 1979. It was nominated for both the Hugo and Nebula and won the Locust for Best Novel. It is about a scientific expedition to Saturn commanded by a NASA career woman named Sirocco Jones. She and her crew discover an alien habitat where they crash land and find themselves separated into a world with centaurs and bird-like humans called angels and giant Senian gas bags called blimps. Sirocco must make the journey to the center of the habitat to confront the main intelligence that seems to be controlling everything. Now, there are trigger warnings for this novel. It's very adult, so do your own research, but I absolutely love Titan and its sequels, Wizard, published in 1980, and the conclusion, Demon, published in 1985. It is a wild, fantastic journey with some of the best world building you'll ever find. We have to give a nod to one of the grandfathers of science fiction. I'm talking about the French author Jules Verne, who was born in 1828 and died in 1905 at the age of 77. He first published in 1863 with 5 Weeks in a Balloon. 1863, yes, that was in the middle of the American Civil War. He mostly wrote speculative works, many times about journeys to undiscovered countries. His most famous works are Journey to the Center of the Earth, published in 1864, and, of course, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, published in 1869. I call him the grandfather because he inspired authors such as H.G. Wells and Edgar Rice Burroughs, who inspired, in their turn, authors of the Golden Age. One book that I think is fascinating is The Mysterious Island, published in 1874. The story is set in America during the Civil War, where a group of Northern prisoners of war escape in a hot air balloon and crash land in, you guessed it, a mysterious island. It's interesting that one member of this group is an ex-slave named Nebuchadnezzar. Now remember, Verne is a Frenchman who was not maybe the best person to write about the experience of a black man during the Civil War, but I appreciate the effort. What many people may not know is Mysterious Island is actually kind of a sequel to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Check it out. Joan Vinci was born in 1948. I don't believe she's that active today. She suffered brain damage from a car accident in 2002 and also suffers from fibromyalgia, although she did write 2 novels since then. She first began publishing short stories as early as 1974. Her debut novel was The Outcasts of Heaven's Belt, published in 1978. But the novel that made her famous is The Snow Queen, published in 1980, which went on to win the Hugo. As you can maybe guess from the title, it is inspired by the Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale of the same name. The story takes place on the mostly water planet Tiamat, which orbits a black hole. Humans are divided into 2 clans, the Summer Clan and the Winter Clan. The rest of humanity can only reach Tiamat when an interstellar gate is opened. I believe it's open for 150 years and then closes for 150 years. The planet alternates their rule between the Winter and Summer matriarchal clans. The story opens with the Winter Clan in power, led by the Snow Queen, Arianrhod, whose life has been extended by the longevity drug harvested from the native sea creatures, which, of course, makes the planet very popular for the rest of the human race. A woman named Moon gets caught up in the politics of Tiamat. Her cousin is whisked off to become the consort to the Snow Queen, and the machinations and politics of the world close in around her. It is a really good book. There's another Vinci in the room. I'm talking about Werner Vinci. And yes, at one time he was married to Joan Vinci. He was born in 1944 and died earlier this year in 2024 at the age of 79. He first published with a short story in 1965. His debut novel was Grimm's World, published in 1969. His novella True Names, published in 1981, is considered by many as the first novel to truly flesh out the concept of cyberspace, which inspired cyberpunk authors like William Gibson and Neil Stephenson. but my favorite of his novels is Fire Upon the Deep, published in 1992, which went on to win the Hugo. Now, what I really loved about Fire Upon the Deep are the aliens, but I don't really want to talk about them because of spoilers. When I first started reading the book, I had no idea what the aliens were until I got several chapters in, and it floored me. So I want you to have that same experience. The premise of Fire Upon the Deep is that the galaxy is divided into these sections where physics operate differently, and that it limits what type of technologies can work. For example, the high zones can operate these really highly advanced artificial intelligences, but those technologies in the low zone have to be pretty much mechanical. Anyway, the story is about a group of humans who crash lands on a planet with an unknown alien species and must figure out how to live in harmony with this strange new world. I'm being very vague here because it's best to go into a story as blind as possible. Vinji wrote another novel set in the same universe. I won't call it a sequel because the story is a standalone, but it is A Deepness in the Sky, published in 1999, and that too went on to win the Hugo and introduces another really fascinating and unique alien race. The last science fiction writer of this group is one I know everyone knows because he has become a household name. Yes, I am talking about Kurt Vonnegut. Vonnegut was born in 1922 and died in 2007 at the age of 84. His debut novel was Player Piano, published in 1952, which is a dystopian story about society formed by the apathy of capitalism. People seem to forget that Vonnegut is first and foremost a science fiction writer. He's won several Hugo Awards and was a contributor to Harlan Ellison's Again Dangerous Visions with a short story called The Great Space. Vonnegut wrote at a time when science fiction wasn't considered real literature. I mean, maybe that's still the case, but it was even more so back in the 60s. So when his seminal novel, Slaughterhouse-Five, or The Children's Crusade, A Duty Dance with Death, came out in 1969, suddenly he was no longer considered a science fiction writer, but rather a literary writer. And then his books started showing up in the general fiction section of bookstores rather than the science fiction section. Actually, what I always thought was wild was that you could find his books written before Slaughterhouse-Five in the science fiction section, but everything written after was in general fiction. But we've got to talk about Slaughterhouse-Five, his science fiction novel about a World War II vet named Billy Pilgrim, haunted by what he witnessed in Dresden, which is a German city that was firebombed by the Allies. This was based on Vonnegut's experience during World War II. Vonnegut later said that the depiction of Dresden in Slaughterhouse-Five was a result of 20 years of work that it took him to articulate his experience at Dresden, at least in a way that satisfied him. Billy Pilgrim is an extremely unreliable narrator who gets unglued from time, and the plot meanders back and forth and sideways through its life, including his encounters with aliens known as Tralfamadorians, who experience time differently. Slaughterhouse-Five is a remarkable book. There's a reason why it took Vonnegut's writing on a completely different trajectory, and he is now a literary icon of American literature. David Weber was born in 1952 and is active today at the age of 72. He was a war game designer for the task force board game Starfire and wrote short stories in the Starfire universe for the game's Nexus magazine. Now, this is important because he is known for military science fiction, and I know a lot of people hear the word military and immediately say, that's not for me. I get it. But when I hear military, I think of war games, and I'll play a few. Think of it Like the first Star Wars movie where the small X-Wing rebel fighters battle the TIE fighters and then they try to destroy the Death Star. That scene is pure military sci-fi where strategy and tactics are on full display. I personally love it, and that's why I love Weber's Honor Harrington series, which starts with On Basilisk Station, published in 1992. Honor Harrington is a commander in the Star Kingdom of Manticore's space fleet and has command of the light cruiser Fearless, which is assigned to patrol the seemingly out-of-the-way port known as Basilisk Station. But Basilisk Station is about to become the center of a galactic conflict when the People's Republic of Haven decide to take it over to take control of a nearby wormhole. And only Honor Harrington and the Fearless stand in their way. This is a high-octane, fast-paced military science fiction. Oh, and if that's not enough, Honor Harrington was adopted by a telepathic cat named Nimitz, who travels with her everywhere. Over a 25-year period, Weber wrote 14 Honor Harrington novels. Let's hop in a time machine and travel back in time to one of the fathers of modern science fiction, H.G. Wells. Wells was born in 1866 and died in 1946 at the age of 79. Wells was a prolific writer, though science fiction wasn't the only thing he wrote. But the sci-fi he did write, which mostly were his early novels, are now the templates for science fiction up to this day, especially in regards to time travel, alien invasion, biological engineering, and so on. Brian Aldiss claimed that Wells was the Shakespeare of science fiction, and I'm not going to argue with that. There are many novels by Wells that I love: Island of Dr. Moreau, Invisible Man, War of the Worlds, but the one I'm going to recommend is his very first novel, The Time Machine, published in 1895. It is about a Victorian gentleman who is at a weekly dinner party where he tells his guests that he has built a time machine, and he even demonstrates with a little model. The following week, the dinner guests return to find the Victorian gentleman looking pretty ragged, who tells them his story about his adventures in a full-scale time machine. He had traveled to the far future where humanity was divided into two species, the pretty childlike Eloi and the ugly underground Morlocks. You probably know the general storyline. It's been adapted several times into movies, but if you haven't yet read the book, I encourage you to read it because it greatly differs from the movie adaptations. We're going to jump from one Wells to another Wells. I'm talking about Martha Wells, who was born in 1964 and is very much active today at the age of 60. She has won 4 Hugos, 2 Nebulas, and 3 Locus Awards. So she's kind of a pretty big deal. Personally, my favorite books by Wells is the Fall of Ilrien trilogy, which starts with The Wizard Hunters, published in 2003, which I think is sort of a science fiction fantasy blend. I highly recommend that trilogy, but we have to talk about the series that won her all those awards. Of course, I'm talking about the Murderbot series, which started with All Systems Red, published in 2017. Murderbot is the name of a cyborg, at least that's what the cyborg calls itself, but everyone else knows it as a security unit or sec unit. Murderbot believes it has murdered humans in the past, but doesn't really have the memories. And it has definitely gone renegade by disconnecting it from its command center or something, but it pretends to be just a normal sec unit so it can get assignments on comfortable missions where it can spend most of its time watching soap operas. What's supposed to be a routine planetary survey mission turns deadly when another planetary team goes on a killing spree, and only Murderbot can stop them. These are actually novella-length stories, but they are fast and fun, written first person from Murderbot's point of view, and the voice is really charming and engaging. If you haven't discovered Murderbot, you're in for a treat. I'm going to make another left turn here because the next author I have is Tad Williams. Tad Williams was born in 1957 and is active today at the age of 67. His debut novel was Tail Chaser's Song, published in 1985, a novel from the point of view of a cat. How cute is that? I say I'm making a left turn because Williams is known for his epic fantasy novels, notably Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn series, which starts with The Dragonbone Chair, published in 1988, and the Shadow March series, which starts with Shadow March, published in 2004. If you like fantasy, I highly recommend both of those series, but my favorite Tad Williams books are from his lesser-known science fiction series called Otherland, which starts with City of Golden Shadow, published in 1996. Now, I'm not sure why this series isn't better known. Maybe because it is epic fantasy length. I mean, these are really hefty books. And science fiction fans aren't into epic length novels. Or if its fan base was mostly fantasy and they weren't that interested in science fiction, I don't know. Anyway, The Otherland is a virtual reality network of virtual worlds created by the Grail Brotherhood, a secret society of very rich men. The Grail Brotherhood is up to something, and several keyboard warriors are drawn to Otherland to discover what is going on. Except for one man, Paul Jonas, who doesn't realize he's in a virtual reality. He thinks he's in the trenches of World War I. This is one of the great epics of speculative fiction. I put it up there with Stephen King's Dark Tower series. I know the length of the novels is daunting, but if you check it out, I don't think you'll regret it. Connie Willis is a prolific writer born in 1945 and is active today at the age of 78. She has won, get ready for it, 11 Hugos and 7 Nebulas, more major science fiction awards than any other writer to date. She started writing short stories for the pulp magazines during the 1970s, and her debut novel, Water Witch, was co-written with Cynthia Felice, published in 1982. My recommendation is Doomsday Book, published in 1992, which won both the Hugo and the Nebula. This is a time travel story, but Willis does something interesting with the time machine here. The machine refuses to operate if the past will be altered and cause a paradox, or it sends the time traveler to a time where the traveler cannot cause a paradox, which could range from shifting them in time in minutes or years. Mostly time travel in the 21st century is used by historians to observe and record the past, and one of these historians is our main character, Kivrin Engel, who specializes in medieval history. Unknown to everyone, there is a deadly influenza epidemic in the 21st century because of COVID. And when Kivrin travels to the past, she arrives decades later than she wanted to during the Black Death, and she arrives sick. It is a really great story and a great introduction to Connie Willis. Robert Anton Wilson was born in 1932 and died in 2007 at the age of 74. And yes, I'm going to talk about the Illuminatus trilogy, which starts with The Eye in the Pyramid, published in 1975, which Wilson co-wrote with Robert Shee. I read this when I was a teenager, and it melted my brain. Even though it was published in 1975, the authors had been working on it since 1969, during the height of the psychedelic movement, which gave birth to the Merry Pranksters and Discordianism, a joke religion that worshipped Eris, the goddess of chaos. Now, some people may not realize that Discordianism was a separate thing from the Illuminati trilogy. The Principia Discordia was an actual mimeographed Bible or manifesto that was passed around. In fact, I got a copy in college during the 80s. Anyway, the Illuminati trilogy is about Discordianism, and it's also about the counterculture and conspiracy theories and Atlantis and magic and sex and drugs. If you are looking for a book that mirrors the psychedelic period of American history of the 60s, 70s, look no further. It's loosely about a pair of police detectives, Saul Goodman and Barney Muldoon, who are investigating the bombing of a leftist magazine, and then they get sucked down into a truly bizarre rabbit hole. I will say up front that these books are not for everyone. They graphically encapsulate this very specific period of American history. But if you do read them, they will definitely be books that will stick in your mind. Finord. Gene Wolfe was born in 1931 and died in 2019 at the age of 87. He is known as a literary science fiction author, meaning his prose is elevated, and his stories are so well formed and told that they almost rise above the genre. Wolfe was named a Grandmaster of Science Fiction, corresponded with Tolkien when he was young, and was in a writing group that included George R. R. Martin. His most famous series is probably The Book of the New Sun, which started with Shadow of the Torturer, published in 1980. This series is about Severian, who starts as an apprentice in the Torturers Guild. Wolfe apparently wrote all 4 volumes of The Book of the New Sun before sending it to the publishers. It's amazing. But you know what's more amazing, in my opinion? The Book of the Long Sun. That's my favorite Gene Wolfe series. It starts with Night Side of the Long Sun, published in 1993, which won the Nebula. It's about a young priest named Patera Silk, who is trying to save his church from being torn down by a crime lord. But the more he learns about his world, the more his belief system unravels. Oh my gosh, it is so good. If you haven't read anything by Gene Wolfe, what are you waiting for? His stories are true works of art. I know some of you will recognize the name John Wyndham, but many of you may not. And that's a shame because he's a really great writer. John Wyndham is a British writer born in 1903 and died in 1969 at the age of 65. He apparently wrote a couple of sci-fi novels in the 1930s under the pseudonym John Bainan, but the first novel under his own name was Day of the Triffids, published in 1951. This was about a meteor shower that blinds everyone who sees it and somehow seeds the earth with triffids, a sort of giant carnivorous plant. His novel, The Chrysalids, published in 1955, is a post-apocalyptic novel about a society that forms based on fundamentalist Christianity that practices eugenics, trying to keep the human race pure from those darn mutants. Margaret Atwood has acknowledged this novel as having influenced her novel, The Handmaid's Tale. But by far my favorite Wyndham book is The Midwich Cuckoos, published in 1957. It is about the town of Midwich, which is struck in this globe of influence where everyone falls unconscious when they eventually wake up. Every woman capable of bearing a child finds herself pregnant. It was made into an amazing film adaptation in 1960 called Village of the Damned, which was remade rather badly in 1995 by John Carpenter, though it was also actor Christopher Reeve's last role. And much to my surprise, it has recently been turned into a pretty decent, in my opinion, miniseries in 2022. If you haven't already, you've got to check out John Wyndham. Roger Zelazny was born in 1937 and died relatively young in 1995 at the age of 58. He was nominated 14 times for the Nebula and won 3 times, and he was nominated 14 times for the Hugo and won 6 times. His most famous series, and the books I recommend, are the Chronicles of Amber, which starts with The 9 Princes in Amber, published in 1970. These are novels about a multiverse where there are 2 true worlds, Amber and Chaos. All other worlds are shadows of the true worlds, which includes Earth, which is a shadow of Amber. A man wakes up on Earth named Carl in a New York hospital with amnesia. Gradually, he begins recovering his memories and finds out he is actually Corwin, one of the 9 princes of Amber who are fighting to control Amber. These novels are really imaginative and engaging and pure escapism. I think you'll love them. Last on this list is a new name, a young adult author. Shiren J. Shao was born in China but immigrated to Canada when they were in the 5th grade. They are a very successful YouTuber and quite prominent on social media. Their debut was the young adult science fiction novel Iron Widow, published in 2021. This is a very loose retelling of the historical figure Wu Zetian, the only female emperor of China. It is heavily influenced by anime and giant robot battle mechs like Gundam or Pacific Rim. It is about Wu Zetian, a girl crippled by having her feet wrapped in the traditional Chinese fashion, who lives in the world of Huaxia that is constantly under attack by these gargantuan aliens known as the Hunduns. The battle mechs that can fight them are run by this male-female pair. The male is always dominant, and the female is often overwhelmed and dies. That's what happens to Wu Zetian's sister, and Wu Zetian is out for revenge. So she signs up to be a concubine, and that's one of the women who are paired with the men who run the battle mechs. There is a lot of anger throughout this book. It simmers on the page in the characters and the situations. There is an exploration of polyamory, not which you usually see in a young adult novel. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for 34 weeks, which is pretty amazing for a debut. And it was shortlisted for several awards, including the Nebula. This is an author you need to watch out for. There you have it, the top 100 science fiction authors according to me. I know many of you have authors you would have also included in the list, so go ahead and remind me down in the comments. And while you're there, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel. And guess what? I also put together a list of my top 100 fantasy authors, so check that out if you are interested. Until we meet again, may all the books you read be blessed.